We're going to do introductions. I want to work through a few items first, and then we'll go around and do some introductions of the RAC members and folks from the department that are here. So, Kelly, if you can go down to the round. Okay, so for the RAC members and members of the public, some awareness for you. Just some ground rules to go over here. The purpose of this meeting is to hear from the different members of the RAC. The RAC members are all here with unique perspectives and interests that are going to help inform the department in this rules advisory committee process. So you're here to express your viewpoint. You don't all have the same viewpoint, so it's important that we give space to hear other people's opinions, perspectives, and interests. That's the value of a conversation like this and a meeting in this format.
On people online, can you hear us?
Very. Online?
I have a thumbs up from Ken and Patty.
Okay, okay, all right. Yeah, we do have. So again, back to the ground rules. Please treat each other respectfully. If you're online, please remain muted when you're not speaking. That helps cut down the interference in the room. Use the raise hand feature for the RAC members that are online. If you do want to provide comment or have questions within the context of our conversation, just let us know. I'll keep an eye on it. Kelly will keep an eye on it. Tim will keep an eye on it. So we'll be looking for your hand. If you're here in person, it is helpful if you raise your hand. That way I can identify you around the room and let you know that, yeah, you know, we see your hand. We're going to get your question or comment in order. Sometimes there's probably be a number of you, so I'll track who has questions and comments and make sure we get those addressed. So for the RAC for the public, this is a RAC meeting. So the intent of the majority of this meeting is for the members of the RAC to have space to have this dialogue. Like I said, great turnout for the public today. The public is here as observers to listen to what's being presented and the conversation that's occurring. We do have 2 designated times for public comment. We can't accommodate everybody. There's a lot of you. We have 15 minutes before break and 15 minutes at the end. If people can keep their comments to 3 minutes, we can probably accommodate 3 to 4 in each one of those breaks, but that's probably pushing it. You know, if we give people 5 minutes to provide comment, that maxes out at 3 people per comment period. So I guess initially a show of hands of people that intend to provide comment today. Okay, nobody here in the room intends to provide comment. Is anybody online?
They're probably. I'll see, there's 2 hands up.
Okay, yeah, well, I'll check back in again before we go to our break when we have our comment period time, but we have 2 online right now. We will put those 2 at the front of the line for 2 comment period times at that break. Maybe the 2 online, if you just want to indicate in the chat to us if you prefer to do your comment at the middle of the meeting or at the end, and we'll fit you in, and then I'll check back in and allow for any additional comments if we have space. But again, that's an opportunity for members of the public to provide comment. The department or the RAC members are not intended to respond to those comments. They're not prepared necessarily with the answers, but we'll hear them. And if there's a response that needs to be provided, that'll come after the meeting email and have an opportunity to get the information. Okay.
Do you have a microphone up there? I'm having a hard time hearing.
I don't. I'll speak as loud as I can, but you can come on a little closer if you want. We got a few extra seats.
I think we're getting a lot of feedback too. I don't know if other people have microphones on that shouldn't have them on, maybe.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
There's just a lot of background noise in the room.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot of us here in the room. For the folks online, they're picking up everything on these microphones up here in the middle of the room. So to the degree that during the meeting, we can keep the conversation to the RAC and quiet in the back, that's going to help this move along. Okay. Moving on. So again, just going over the role here. The role of the RAC, attend and participate in the meeting around the square or horseshoe or online, provide input and advice to help the department consider the various perspectives. The public's role, listen only during the presentation, the RAC discussion from the audience or online, and provide input, advice during the designated comment time. The role of the department is to facilitate the meeting. So my name is Brian Keekly. I'm actually a neutral facilitator with a company called the Langley Group. So my job is just focused on process to help make sure everybody has the opportunity to participate on the RAC. Foster collaboration, consider the RAC and the public feedback, and ultimately the department's role is to draft the final rules. And we'll get into some timeline for those of you that might be new to this to understand when all this is intended to occur. All right, so we have a packed agenda today, and we want to try and get through all this. So we all want to try to be considerate of that. Fiscal impacts discussion, we have some time for that. Sub-basin approach, we have 20 minutes for that. We'd like to keep those to the allotted time because what we're going to spend a lot of time today is the rule language review. It was provided in advance. I know y'all didn't get it with a lot of time to look at it. But this is going to be, maybe a little tedious, but it's necessary to go through these rules line by line. And when we get to that, just so you're aware, the expectation isn't necessarily always that you've seen all these ahead of time and you're prepared to give us the input, but we want to receive any input you have as we move through line by line in those rules. If you need more time, that's fine. This isn't something that needs to be finished today. We're gonna go back into this at our next meeting, and you'll have time between the meetings to digest it and come back with feedback. So we're gonna spend a good chunk of the time working through that rule language before and after break. But then we're gonna have a hard stop at 4:15. So we want to turn it over to Holly, who's the facilitator from the collaborative, to share the community efforts for groundwater and the opportunities that exist there. We want to make sure we get that in this meeting. Then we'll go to comment, and then we really got to end at 5. There's another meeting that's starting here after, and the room needs to change over. So we're gonna hold the agenda pretty closely today. And if we don't get through the draft rule language, that's okay. We're just gonna stop where we stop, pick it up at the next meeting, and do the community efforts for groundwater report this evening. Okay, next slide. So the goals for today: begin the discussion of the fiscal impact, review the draft rule language, build a shared understanding on the lot allocation and implementation of the PTW, build understanding and awareness of the community efforts to reduce groundwater use. So we're gonna get into introductions. We'll start here with the department and go around the room. There was a request, and I think this is a great idea to allow the RAC members, if there's questions that you have, that up to this point, and there's things that you still don't understand or questions that you have, if you want to share those during your introduction, we're not going to get into a conversation right now during introductions, but just share your question so that I can record it. And then as we get into our presentations throughout the day, the presenters from the department can find a way, if it's appropriate, to fold in responses to those questions. Understood? Okay, Jan, why don't you go ahead and we'll go around this way.
My name is Tim Seymour. I'm the assistant manager for the groundwater section of the Water Resources Department, and I'm based out of
Hi, my name is Kelly Mines. I am the policy analyst, rule coordinator, one of the two for the department.
Ben McKenna, just a domestic well person, and have a little bit of land.
Kristen Shellman, Harding County Commissioner and the county representative on the RAC.
Ivan Gall with Water Resources Department out of our Salem office. I'm the division administrator for the Field Services Division and acting deputy director for the water management side of our business.
Barbara Howard, RAC member and irrigator. Angie Ketcher, RAC member, landowner.
Karen Moon, I'm the coordinator for the Watershed Council.
Brenda Smith, RAC member. Julie Weichel, RAC member, and Jim Twell.
Fred Otley, Diamond. We have groundwater and surface water. I'm a member of the RAC. You're next.
I'm Roger Shealy. I'm part of the RAC. I do have some questions. I have a list of questions, but one of the things that I'm proposing that we consider doing in the next meeting is setting that part of the agenda as being, now we're all starting to learn about what's going on. It took us a while to catch on, but it seems like when you create these agendas, rather than just pushing them forward, they need some revisiting of the past for, some time so that we can, discuss some of the things that you brought up that we would like to talk about, or that I would like to talk about. I have questions, each meeting I've had questions, I never have gotten any answers to any of them. And it needs, I think in order for this to be reasonable, we need to set aside some agenda time to address those questions that didn't get answered every meeting, so that we have time to, reflect on what's been said, because we listen and then go home and we spend nights awake trying to figure it out. And once we do, we have questions and we have, we're interested in knowing more about what you're thinking. And I think it needs to be, that process needs to be included in the agenda on every agenda. Because I think we're now learning that we can have reasonable dialogue. And so I'm hoping you'll consider that.
Where's the singhos? Irrigator. I have lots of questions too. I will start with, I would like a discussion or some more clarification on critical groundwater area designation and how those definitions fit and how all the subgroups that were put into that, how they fit, because there's a lot of I don't think they belong. And so I'd like a discussion about how you define those so we can understand your process. And yeah.
Larissa, can I ask a question, Paul, there? When you say subgroups, do you mean sub areas?
Sub areas, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So an understanding of how we define the sub areas, or?
No, not how you define the sub areas, but how you came to terms with designating the whole basin as a critical groundwater area when some of the sub areas don't fit the criteria.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Tom Davis, I'm a lifetime water user, and I agree with her question there on how you put us all in one fold.
Mark Owens, irrigator. I too have a list of questions. I'm still waiting for answers of questions that I submitted back on January 23rd. I will add to that list and get them and ask for written comments back. But the big one I think we're all struggling with here is that we configure PTW off of hydrographs, and we're going to put into targets to reach the 0 rate of decline. I'd like to know how we measure success. What will groundwater levels be in 5, 10, 15, 20, and so on, once full PTW is implemented?
How has that worked in Umatilla?
Any other questions?
No, I'll submit one. Verbally, I don't think.
Ken Vance, irrigator, RAC member. Your turn.
Andy Root, irrigator, RAC member, and I have PTW question. When we get to that, we need to spend some time.
Louis Mold, crack member, irrigator.
Okay, anybody else I missed from the department that wants to introduce themselves? Thanks, Andrea.
Hold on, Brian.
Sorry.
Alexandria Scott, Community Engagement Coordinator for the East Region, and I support the Harney Place-Based Planning Group in that role and the Upper Grand Rapids Place-Based Planning Group.
Okay, we'll leave it at that, and move on. So Kelly, you want to pick it up?
We have a couple, we have, 2 OWRD members online.
Oh, yeah.
It's fine. Well,
Oh, yeah, my bad.
yeah.
You want to start with the department? We go to Dark and Laura.
Good afternoon, everybody. Dark Boschman. I'm a hydrogeologist in the groundwater section with OWRD, based here out of the Salem office.
Clicking the wrong buttons here. Laura Hart, Water Policy Analyst, and the other Rules Coordinator, just lending Kelly some support today. Thanks.
Thank you. And let's see, RAC members online. let's start with, get into this right now. Maybe you guys might know Brandon than I do.
Start there.
Brandon?
Afternoon, Brandon Haslick, Burns Paiute Tribe, RAC member.
Can I see Lisa?
Yeah, Lisa Brown, staff attorney with Water Watch of Oregon, RAC member.
Brianna.
Brianna O'Connor with the Harney Soil and Water Conservation District, RAC member.
Oh, John, yeah. Commissioner Rao? John Rao?
Yes, I'm here.
Anybody else we missed online? Okay, let's continue on.
Okay, so again, my name is Kelly Mines. I'm the policy analyst slash rule coordinator for the department. This is our projected timeline and kind of the schedule for the rulemaking. We started the first RAC way back in April of last year. We're currently going through RACs 2 through 8. Plan to do a public comment period after May, so I think it's August is when we're doing the public comment period. I have on top of my head. And then from there, we're going to prepare staff recommendations and bring the draft rules, the proposed draft rules to the commission. So our timeline is, again, we are, so October, starting at this middle here, where this middle point here, so October 25th and 24th, we're doing RACs 2 through 8. Public comment period will be August through October, and then October through December, we will work on the staff report to the commission, and then look for adoption of these rules December 2024.
So can I ask a question? Sure. How do you see us interacting with you? Are we just here absorbing whatever you say and saying, well, whatever? Or are we playing a role in this? I can't figure out whether we have a role here to play. Or are we just here so you can check off the list that says we talk to the public? I can't figure it out.
I think the agenda items today are gonna be, there's gonna be a big need to get some feedback from all of you on these. So you're here to provide input for the.
And does our input have any merit or credibility?
This is a great question, Roger. So I kind of want to lay out where we have been and why we are here today and why we are starting the rule conversation, the rule language. And this is really where the meat and the potatoes come. And this is where we write down clearly and plainly in rules, this is our plan for Harney County. And when we go through these rules, Roger, we ask you to give us comments. Oh, I don't like that. I don't think that's going to work for the community. And we can have those conversations. We're going to write a lot of notes today. And then we go back and look at those notes and we change the language based off of what we hear. So you are having a direct impact. Now, up until this RAC right now, right, we've been laying out our plan and trying to, I'm going to say figuring out our plan as we go, because this is all very, very new to us. The rules were just adopted for Division 10 last year. And so we're trying to figure this out, right? So if I can, does that answer your question? And I'm not trying to dismiss your feelings.
No, I'm just trying to figure out whether we actually have a role to play, or we're just here to hear what the state's gonna do to us. And there's a difference in how we handle ourselves and how we approach. We're trying to authentically be constructive and to try to solve some of the problems. And do it in the most economically and ecologically sensible way. We hope you're interested in that as well. And so far, the dialogue's been, in my view, guys, and you can help me if I'm speaking out of turn here, but it's been one-sided completely. And I don't know what our responsibility is yet. Just to listen. And if that's the case, it's not very useful to us. we're hoping we can have an interaction where we actually come up with some new ways of addressing the problem. I don't know if that's what you have in mind or not.
Well, and can I just add to that? I think part of what the concern that I've, heard from folks is we feel the timeline's a little aggressive to be able to have that depth of conversation. And so as you present the timeline, a presentation of a finished plan with full community input, working through things the state's never done with voluntary agreements. Us as a community have to develop and have conversations in 15 sub-basins. The timeline seems very aggressive to ever accomplish that unless this is just a box checking exercise. And I don't feel that that's your intention. And so I think in communicating some flexibility in the timeline that, it'll go to the commission when we've actually had time as a community to thoroughly work through these things that we're trying to achieve is going to be helpful to communicate out, because right now it's saying December presentation to the commission. That feels a little trigger happy to most of us.
Okay, I hear what you're saying.
And then I would like to add to it. So, on your paper here, you have presenting 15 sub areas, okay?
Yeah.
There's probably 80 people in this room, and there might be 3 or 4 of you that know how you calculated the PTW, or even what a PTW is. I'm on the RAC, I've been to the meeting, and I can't for the life of me figure out how you guys authorized 289,000 acre feet of water, okay? Then you estimated use of 137,000 feet of water, and then proposed use of 106,000 acre feet of water. How did you create these calculations? I mean, was it statistics? Did you pull it out of your butt? So, or did you really have a way that you could put on a whiteboard that all the simple people could understand that if I cut back at Rock Creek, it says here 76%, I'm gonna save the world. I mean, you does that, is that a?
So let's talk about that, right? So
I think that everyone is, that's why they're all sitting out there, I think.
So authorized use is a calculation that comes from water rights. So each water right has a place of use with a total acreage, and it has a duty. So the total volume of water per acre that can be applied under that water right. Generally in the Harney Basin, the duty is 3 acre feet. The POUs vary in size from very small to very large. So tens of acres to thousands of acres. Authorized use is the sum when you take each water right and multiply the total number of acres by the total duty, getting you a total volume of authorized use per water right. You sum that up and that comes out to 280-some thousand acre feet number that you got there.
Yep.
Over the 6 years of 2016 to 2022-ish, maybe even a little bit earlier than that, the department collaborated with the United States Geological Survey to put together a groundwater study, to understand the system. And out of that came water use estimates. And those estimates are based on the science of open ET, so evapotranspiration, combined with where we had flow meter data to be able to come to estimated use.
I'm gonna pause here for a second too.
Yeah.
How many people in this audience understand what he's saying? How many people don't understand what he's saying? So besides going to this orally to answer Chinese questions, what I think you need to do, we need this written back out into language that people can understand.
Sure.
How many people know what PTW is? How many people know what open ET is? So if what you're saying is going over the heads of 50 to 60% or more. Tim, sorry.
It went over my head. That's why I'm here.
So I guess
Like, how
to
do you
really
expect
simple-
us to agree to a rule when we don't even know how the calculation was created? You know what I'm saying?
Yes, so to simplify it as much as I possibly can, we came up with authorized use using the water rights. We estimated use through scientific methods as part of the groundwater study. And that estimated use tells us how much water was actually pumped out of the ground at those times.
Okay, so can I stop you there? And how many wells did you use to create that? You know what I'm saying?
I don't have that number off the top of my head, Andy. I'd have to go back.
Oh, still,
No,
but
but
that's something,
are you asking how many wells were metered to
right?
collaborate with the
Right,
data from the satellites?
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
Yeah,
I would also like to ask, everybody has to have a meter. You guys should have an actual use of all the water that was drawn out of the ground in every year for the last 10 years. Everybody has, we are required by law to have a water meter on every irrigation plan. We report that every year. Why don't you guys have an actual use out of the last 10 years from all the crap that we have sent into the state of Oregon? It shouldn't be an estimated water use, it should be the water use that we use.
So I think we're also, like, I'm a scientist, I would really like to verify some of these procedures and numbers and how you collected them. These statistics, I can get them to say what I wanted them to say. I know you did the best you have with the data you have. The question is, what are the confidence intervals on them? How confident are we? Do they have probability distributions? We know that are not exact. If you did inverse distance weighting, or you did some kriging on some wells you had to figure out what the water table was at a certain time. You know, what are the statistical confidences in those? We need to see that stuff, because we're impacting a lot of people's lives. And we just need the confidence that you have in your data. And I think we're gonna have to look into it in order for us to be able to have that confidence.
So just taking a step back and looking at the process here, you know, hearing what folks are saying, that we need to package this, communicate it in a way that everyone's gonna understand. And maybe we need to take a little bit more time to understand your questions so that it can be presented in the right way.
And now you're gonna have to put on a class
Yeah.
and
well,
teach us how you created these rules. We're not saying that what you did was wrong, but it would be very important for us to understand how you got here. You know what I mean? When you create this, don't you start with a static level and then a contour map, right? Isn't that what you do? To create these PTWs?
Maybe it would be helpful to summarize the last 6 years of work in the USGS team and our team coming to the basin quarterly for 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
That answered all those questions, Andy. Now, the rules are building on that, but the scientific discussion, and Roger, looking to your questions, was discussed in depth numerous times with the community.
No, it was not with me. Every time I've been here, I asked for that. Every time.
We can point you to the reports.
Every time I've asked, well, can I see the model?
Okay,
That's what I
the
said.
model report isn't out yet.
I know, that's what I've been saying. I want to see the model because I need to know.
We'll get it to you as soon as
Validate
it's
it.
out.
What's that?
We'll get it to you as soon as it's out.
Okay, but
It's published.
let's not rush into rules until we can see what this model is.
The flow model isn't gonna dictate what the rules look like.
Well, what role does the model play?
It can help us with some simulation runs, to do some forward-looking things, evaluate PTW numbers down the road,
Does
look
it,
at trends in
does it-
groundwater levels.
does it determine PTW
No, it
numbers?
won't be used.
What does it do? Because one of the things I know is.
Okay, let me take a break here, because these are valid, and I'm not, by no means do I not want to discount that we need to address these things. But what I think we probably need to do is hear from the group, maybe not at this moment, but understand, all right, exactly how can we present this back? Not saying present it, but maybe educate and do it in a way that, and take the time that's necessary so that people can understand it and have all their questions answered and have the right dialogue around that. And I think that's probably important, and that needs to happen. And the department's not necessarily prepared for that right now, I don't believe, so we need to put a pin in it and make sure we do that right. I say we don't want to get ahead of ourselves now and have conversations that are dependent on knowing that first. So I guess I would look to our agenda, ask the question, what can we have conversations around today that we prepared for that aren't going to be that information isn't critical, right? So that we can have that conversation at a future meeting.
And this is the most critical part of you're asking these people to take a 70% cut in the water.
I understand, but we can't spend time on a topic that we're not prepared
So,
to
but you wanna
discuss.
spend time making rules on something that,
So Andy, we went, as we've gone through this process, we have talked about how we were gonna delineate sub areas, right? So how do we decide what the boundaries are? We talked about criteria. People in this room looked at the criteria. We asked for feedback. We received feedback. We then moved from defining the criteria to applying the criteria. We divided the basin up into these sub areas based on these criteria. We then went from those criteria to now, what are we gonna look at to determine how we go about calculating the PTW? So what is the most important thing? Rates of decline and magnitudes of decline, right? Where are the most severe declines occurring, and where have declines occurred in substantial quantities, right?
We just need to see those numbers and see how you got them, so we can feel good about that they're correct, because we worry about that.
Absolutely. So we've presented in the RAC meetings, those numbers and the calculation for how we got there. We've also provided in the RAC packets, different memos and explanations of how these calculations were done, right? So, and where we've referenced where the data is coming from, and most of it comes from the groundwater study that was done in collaboration with the USGS. So we've gone through this process to talk about this and to allow input and to have feedback and have a constructive conversation. And so I guess I am caught off guard when I hear you say you haven't had the opportunity to provide input and we haven't essentially showed our work, because I feel like I'm doing everything I can to try to make it clear and transparent what process we're following. And we're trying to follow that process in as scientific a way as possible to make it clear what our problem is and what solutions are available to us, so that we can then have this rule writing discussion and talk about how do we get to these solutions. At the end of the day, I can't change what the end all solution has to be, and that is a reduction in groundwater use. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt that we're pumping more than the system can sustain because we have groundwater level declines. And so we have to then come up with, well, how do we decrease groundwater use and do that in a way that is balanced and fair and we do our absolute best to minimize the impact to the community. And that's what we've been trying to do. And if that hasn't come across, I guess I'll have to go back and think about the process and
Just as it goes back to the original thing. I mean, you come here, you know what you're gonna talk about. We listen to it. It's pretty new to us. And then we go home and think about it some more, but then you're moving on to the next thing that confuses us to the next thing. So I just think we need to step back and look at how some of this stuff was derived, so we have confidence in the numbers that are correct. That's all we don't know how these numbers are generated. And it matters. It matters big if these things have confidence intervals or probability distributions that we can rely on being sensible. And we've never seen any of that.
Ryan, it might be helpful to ask folks to put together a list of questions. Because Brian's right, we're not prepared. We can answer some of these things on the fly, but if you want to take a deep dive into a topic and have us distill it down into as user-friendly as we can get it, and it will never be that easy at times. It's scientific information, some of it is. We're certainly happy to do that, but we're gonna need some time to do it.
Yeah, and I think getting those questions is gonna help put a format together that's gonna be beneficial. Maybe it's visually, because it is hard, if you're just describing it to track. But if we can put it together visually in a way that's easily understood, that might be the best way to do it, but you know, having a back and forth conversation about it right now, we're probably not gonna get there and build the understanding because we can't present it the right way. But I've got a question right
And then Lisa has a question.
Okay.
So, as you guys know, at the table, I brought a lot of technical issues through many meetings, and they weren't all addressed, having to do with artificial, natural, aquifer recharge, aquifer identification, those sorts of things. And to go along with Andy and the other points, Rogers, from a public information standpoint, for the people here, the study was done by Water Resources Department and US Geological Survey. And that information, the study part by USGS, has not been made available to the public. And so that's a piece here that I think is a part of the discussion going around the table right now. And I think it's important to bear that in mind. And so anyway, I'll just leave it there that we don't know even when that's going to be available to us or the public, correct?
So let me clarify there. The groundwater study, water use estimates, etc., was all published and has all been made publicly available. And if you want links to it or a hard copy, let me know and I can get that for you. The only thing that has not been published at this point is the groundwater flow model. And the groundwater flow model takes the information from the study and tries to make it useful for understanding what changes in the system will do to groundwater levels in the system. So at the end of the day, it doesn't tell us what the right number is for PTW. It doesn't tell us how we should go about writing these rules. What it tells us is potentially what the outcomes of that could be based on that model. Okay. And that is still in the publication process, and we hope to have it soon, but I can't promise a timeline because I don't know a timeline. It's in the USGS's publishing network. So as soon as it's available, we plan on making it available to everybody and looking at it ourselves and seeing what it could be used for in this process. But at this point, we don't believe it is necessary in order to understand what the groundwater level trends are, because all that we need in order to understand that is what we have already, and that is the actual water level measurements that we've been collecting for decades in this basin.
Okay, Lisa, online, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and say that maybe we could have like an informational session at some other time, and we could go over this 9-page memo that's in the packet on sub-basin PTWs and also kind of the key points from that groundwater study. Because, I agree, it is a lot of information, and, a lot of us were waiting for a long time for that groundwater study to come out. And there was, of course, the community-based study advisory committee that was meeting regularly with the USGS and OWRD. So I guess I would just kind of second the idea of like an informational session to really let everybody get these questions out. But to do that at some other time when the department can maybe prepare some materials.
Thank you. Yeah, great. Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Just maybe some process for here is maybe we need to figure out what our areas of agreement might be. Because when we started conversations with a swamp critical groundwater designation, you went through elements on what caused a critical groundwater designation. Now we have questions on that we divided the basin into 15 administrative areas. Do some of those even reach the threshold of a 3-foot decline for 10 years on all those? Because we feel, some of us feel, that some of those determinations might not be there. So having an understanding of where agreements could be. Also, what is science and what is policy decisions? Because policy decisions are determining and driving a lot of these numbers. Period. If you take zero rate of decline to base PTW off it, that's a policy decision. We don't know if we agree with that policy decision collectively around this room. So we also need to understand that. I could go on and on, but we need to find some time for this group to work through that. Asking us all to put out individual questions at individual times won't get us there. It might be a whole meeting where we go through every step of it and add further agreement where there's not. And we focus on the policy decision. Because we feel we should have some, it shouldn't be the department's policy decision, it should be the department working with the community. And we don't feel that you have worked with us yet, honestly, on those you've presented. We haven't had back and forth. We haven't talked whether voltage should be critical groundwater designation. We haven't talked whether we agree in the next 10 years, 20 years or 30 years, zero rate decline is acceptable. Is our goal in 30 years maybe to get zero rate decline? Maybe it is, but we haven't sat down and had that discussion with you guys.
Okay, mine is a real simple question.
One second, I apologize, and I don't want to cut you off, but try to keep the conversation in the rack, because if I open it up to everybody in the public, we can't really stay on track, but
Thank you, Kurt. Next week.
It's just a real simple question. Are you gonna let me ask it or no?
if it's simple and everyone else in the group agrees, then not asking more questions.
Water right, either ground and river. And I know the concept of senior rights. I know the concept of allocating too much water, not having minimum flow. Why is it so complicated that if we're pumping too much water, we don't go down the water right list and the inferiors are off the rest of them? So why is it so complicated?
Okay,
That's my question, but I don't know the answer.
okay, we can capture that question. Again, I don't know if the department's prepared to answer it right now, but valid. Okay. What I'd like to be able to do is clearly there's a lot of information that people want, and there's a discussion that needs to happen, and we're not discounting that at all. And I think we're probably gonna find a way to do that. What I would ask is we're able to move forward with the agenda, knowing that the department is aware of these questions, these concerns, these fears about moving too far ahead, and consider that as we present this information so that we're not leapfrogging important items. I don't want the impression that we're dismissing and moving on, but there is a lot of great information that was prepared today, a lot of things that are, you know, around the edges of this discussion that I think we could have some good dialogue around. But ensure that we'll come back to make sure this conversation happens.
But I would ask that we spend a few minutes now figuring out how we're gonna have that conversation, when we're gonna have the conversation, so we don't come to the next RAC meeting without that conversation and get the same conversation. Well, I use conversation a lot.
I agree, and I think it needs to happen. I just don't know if the department's in a position to say, we're dedicating the next meeting to that, or we're gonna hold another meeting between now and then, and it's gonna be an X day or time. And I don't want to put them on the spot.
I don't think you can move forward until you.
So, I guess what I would ask, one is, how many people on this rack watched our informational sessions or participated in the informational sessions that we did prior to the start of this? Okay,
All the documents.
and then for those that missed meetings, how many watched the recording of that meeting and reviewed the presentations?
That, you're not gonna get a fair subset of hand, because he has two questions there. Yes, how many people missed meetings, and if they missed meetings, how many they watched, so. You're not gonna get a fair representation answer.
Fair. What I'm trying to get at is, in order to have this conversation, we all need to spend the time to understand the information that has been presented already. And we need to come to a list of questions that we need to talk through. So I think the best way to move forward is to come up with that list of questions, to go through it, and maybe we take 10 minutes now, 15 minutes now, and we write down all these questions. And then we can from our perspective, from our side, go back, look at it, figure out how to answer those questions effectively. Point people to the resources where those questions have been answered, if they've already been answered, or we'll figure out how to get you answers to those questions. Does that seem like a reasonable way to move forward? I think somebody over here had comments, so I'd love to hear those.
Brandon.
So I think there are questions, right? And there's been, 6 years of information. But I think what's trying to be said is that it feels like we can answer your questions, but we're not like gonna change our stance on how we're moving forward. I think what we're trying to say is that, is there a way that we actually can offer input and something changes about what you all are proposing?
Negotiation. So to get to that, I think there are negotiables and there are non-negotiables. When the statute says the department must determine to maintain reasonably stable groundwater levels, I don't think we can compromise on our statutory requirement. And we spent a lot of time arguing about the department, whether or not the department failed to do that to begin with. And I don't think that's a productive conversation. We can only move forward.
But you have to define reasonably stable.
Absolutely. So now that's something that we can talk about and is in the proposed rule language and that we can go through and we can have a conversation around. And decide, is the definition that's laid out fair or not? And does it match with what we think is reasonable or not, right? So I think that is a perfect example of a place where we have a non-negotiable and a negotiable. And how we move forward in this process.
Another negotiable, how do we implement the PTW? How long does it take to get? That's something we want to have a conversation to today, that we also have written in rules, right? And then, so, I'm hearing a lot of questions, right? Imagine if you want to.
Yeah, hey Kelly, just for newcomers in the room, can you say what PTW is?
So
Describe it, just so that people that are just tuning into the conversation know what we're talking about.
So PTW is a term that was defined in or was used in statute. And it is essentially, the acronym stands for permissible total withdrawal. And it is the amount of pumping allowed to occur within some boundary within the critical groundwater area. Now, that could be a sub-area boundary, or that could be the entire critical groundwater area. But it's the amount of water that's allowed to be pumped out of the ground under permit in that area annually. And it's we are focused on an annual basis. So how much per year can be pumped in that area?
Okay, so, I want to think, sure, yeah, when I, up top of this meeting, I said, this is the meat and potatoes. This is where we start having those conversations. Someone said, Laura Wilson shouldn't be a sub area. Let's have that conversation, let's talk about it. But the, RACs 1 through 4 was really laying out our methodology. So that was Tim was talking about. If you did not see that, watch that video, but we have laid out the methodology and we have written a lot of documents. Doug has written a lot of documents explaining our methodology. And Roger, if you have questions, we're totally willing to ask that. I'm hearing that we want an informational session. We can look into that. We can look into that where it could just be, maybe, is it a session where you want us to just sit and then you ask us questions and we can answer? Then we're gonna need a list of questions. And I agree with him. I think we take 10 to 15 minutes, starting from the top. Let's start at the very top, the boundary, the critical ground area. Are the questions around that, and then kind of work our way through down to the volume of water. Let's take 10 to 15 minutes, Brent.
Sure, yeah. We're just gonna capture them, any questions that are still out there. And we'll determine how we're gonna be able to come back and present that and share that information and have that dialogue. Probably won't be able to do it right now, but let's hear the questions if you have them, or you know them now. We can also take those after. You don't need them right now.
Just throw one thing in here. I have been to meetings for years on all of this stuff. I've seen graphs, I've seen people stand up here and do all kinds of different presentations. I mean, this has been going on for years. You said it, all those meetings we went to, lots and lots of meetings on this particular subject. This is just the last process. Been going on for years. And I sent emails, and I have read emails, and I've done all these different things. So when you guys sit here and say this is something new, I disagree.
I didn't say it was new. I wanted to know how they come up with the PTW. That's what I said.
You know, had you been here years ago, you might have seen it.
Okay, hold on, that's not important right now, we still need to move forward and understand it right now. And there has been information that's been out there, we're gonna have a presentation at the end of the day to talk about some of the stuff that's been happening prior to this. But regardless, we need to understand the data, we need to understand the numbers, so we're gonna find opportunity to do that. Alexander.
Yeah, Brian, I think it might be helpful for the RAC, and then we can also post this on our Division 512 webpage, but it might just be helpful to have a summation of over the years, the different resources that have been created for folks. So whether you're tuning in today, whether you've been here for 5 years, for 6 years, whether you're part of place-based planning, you can come in with an understanding of what resources have been created thus far. And then if there's questions based on those, we can kind of go from there, because Kelly's right, we did host 6 informational sessions last summer that were great at building a foundational understanding of some of what we're talking about in these roles. But if there's questions around the groundwater study and what kind of stuff was done there, we have a whole web page on the groundwater study. And maybe it's just orienting folks around, hey, these are the resources, now what questions?
Sure, yeah.
Based on all the information that's been shared at various stages over 8 years, then we can really get an understanding of where are those points that folks need clarification, and where are the points that people want to have conversations, because it might not be the same thing.
Right. Absolutely, I think that's a great idea. We can go back, identify all the resources that are out there, make sure the RAC has access to all those. I mean, I'll be the first to say though, we all have a day job, right? This isn't something we can spend all our time on. And so finding that opportunity too, to be able to have an information center session, pull this into a future RAC meeting so we can make sure we're all on the same page moving forward. I think all that together is something that we can find time to do. Yes.
Brian, I'd like to just raise a point at this point in this tough discussion. There are hundreds of domestic wells in this county that are not subject to any kind of a curtailment. Those people are hardly in this room. There's a few, but for the most part, they're not here because they haven't been faced with a chart that says you will cut your usage by X amount by such and such a date. So there's a different threat level, if you will, for these two populations. I'd like to remind the audience that nonetheless, this is a very real threat. The declining water level in the Harney Basin is a very real threat for those domestic well users. It's their home, it's their garden, it's their 4-H calves water. It's very real, and for lots of them, they moved to Harney County, whether that was this generation or several generations ago, partially because they were willing to live on the desert's terms. And so when the groundwater disappears, however that happened, and we'll blame drought a good deal, but we've also got some other factors, that's very real. And I just want to remind the room that that factor sits out there. Now, I know, thanks to some conscientious legislators, there's a fund so that when these people are harmed and they no longer have water coming out the kitchen tap, they can apply for a grant and dig the well deeper. Frankly, that's very kind, but that's not part of this solution. Part of this solution is to learn to live on the desert's terms.
That's all.
Appreciate that comment. Okay,
So with Tim's idea to flush it out, are we thinking a different meeting to figure out the zones of agreement? What are negotiable, what are not negotiable, starting from the top? I mean, we're getting close. Let's, if you don't mind, let's not go on to something else till we all have a collective agreement. Where is that time frame? A little bit more.
I guess I would request that 3 weeks. I'd like to see the groundwater user community's ideas on amounts of reduction. What does reasonably stable mean to them? And the timeline to get to those reductions. We've started to lay out a starting position for the agency. That's what it is to get the discussion going. We've had no feedback from anybody else. So we need that. We'll schedule the next RAC meeting to be an informational meeting. And we'll have 4 hours.
We have to know where those numbers came from. Not just the numbers, but how they were gotten, how many of them, where they were taken from, how accurate are they? We need to know the details.
Not to get me to what I'm talking about, Roger.
For me to make the estimates is what I think these numbers are. I need to have the details of how these numbers were actually.
I think your questions, I'm gonna not let my blood pressure go up too much. You're asking groundwater users that maybe they should have been paying attention, but just now have found out that maybe they're gonna be in a critical groundwater designation, these are dropping 0.3 to 0.2 inches a year in different areas, to come to you with what they're gonna curtail?
I think
You're asking groundwater users that don't know what's going on, haven't talked to the community in 3 weeks to come to you with suggestions?
Yeah, I think bring us a starting
Wow.
point, Mark.
And we can't get our questions answered here where we have agreements, or there should be a critical groundwater designation, and you want us to come to you with solutions? That's ridiculous. I'm sorry.
I think what we're looking for is a starting place,
Thanks, Brian.
not the solution.
I know I'm not on the NRAC, but I came to the meeting here 15 or whenever that was. I bought a little ranch on Coffee Pot 20 years ago with an 1884 surface water right. I've had a couple domestic wells on that place go dry since then. We re-drilled them, didn't go down very far, the static came right back, and we watch what we do. We don't pump as long on our lawn and different things. We're keeping our yard alive. 4 years ago, I had a chance to buy a 400 gallon minute, 2 little pivots across the street from me with a 1991 certificate. I remember asking you at that meeting in 16 or whenever, when the state was punching holes all over state ground that had been grazed for 100 years, why we were doing that. If we had a problem and we thought there was a problem, I talked to the well driller because we drill my cattle across there every spring. And I said, how many are these gonna drill? And he said, we can drill 10 of these 600 feet deep until we don't hit any water on the state's nickel. We'll keep at it until we find water. They drilled quite a few of them dry. They got a few that have water on them and good ones. You looked at me and said the state has a right to that water too. That was the answer. I wanted to know why we were drilling more if we had such a problem. And so for me, you know, I'm no alfalfa farmer until 4 years ago. The only reason I have a cow herd left today is because I bought that farm 4 years ago. And the first year it put up 300 tons. The next year it put up 225 with an 80-foot pumping level that had been there for 20 years. It broke suction on the 3rd and we shut it off the 1st of September. Last year, that farm put up almost 400 tons of hay. I never had a problem. I never lowered the well. We just ran it and went. But I don't think there's been any recognition that we've just been through hell in this county with one of the worst droughts we've had in a long, long time. I agree there needs to be some reduction, but it's a real hard pill to swallow to wake up and find out
that we're gonna shut this thing off in 9 months. When I came to a meeting and asked you, why were we drilling 10 wells, maybe dry, and developing a bunch of stuff that had been grazed for 100 years? And your response was this, the state has a right to that water too. I think the problem people have is that there's no notice at all. So we've lost an inch or two, or in some places, and who knows how much in others. But so what? We lost 3 acre-feet in 9 years. We went through a hell of a bad drought for the last 3. So that's my frustration, is to find out that my well with a 91 certificate that hasn't had the pump lower in 35 years is gonna get shut off because we're gonna go to zero net loss. I think everybody realizes we need to manage the water, and we need to conserve, and we need to be wise, and we need to recognize that our neighbors have a right to have domestic water in their well as well. But to just tell this county we're gonna shut off back to, I saw something that said 1965 on the critical groundwater area that I am in. Believe me, if you think Harney County's a dusty little place, it is gonna get dustier, and there's not gonna be a whole lot here. There's gonna be a lot of Airbnbs out there because there's gonna be some people that aren't living here anymore and have to go somewhere else.
Okay, I appreciate it. There's clearly a lot of emotion, and there's a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation and just confusion around this. I think the best thing to do maybe is take a short break. We can recap.
Guys in the room, I just want to, like, there's 2 RAC members with hands raised, so just want to make that note before you break. I don't know if you saw them.
Anybody off, but I do think we need to maybe just regroup for a second, because we have an agenda built up that maybe we don't, and I don't think it's appropriate to ram an agenda down anyone's throat that's not what you want to talk about or doesn't feel appropriate. So I think it might be beneficial to take a break, let the department and myself kind of reassess what the best path forward is for today's meeting, what the next, maybe we can sketch out what the next steps might be, and then return in 10 minutes or so and be able to have that conversation. And I'm not putting, I see Brandon, Lisa, I see both your hands there. I suppose leave them up if you feel like you need to want to provide your comment now.
It might be good to get their comments, just so you guys can have a whole base of the comments before you go out, because they might have a perspective.
Sounds good. Okay, Brandon, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for taking my comment. This is, I guess I'm a little confused, you know, when Mark, you know, you've been along with this process for years and years. You've been along with the groundwater study. You've been along with the place-based planning. So, you know as well as I do that we've never had irrigators in the room throughout the entire process, and we knew that this was going to be potentially a problem at some point. And now it's kind of coming to fruition. Our fears are coming to, but we could see that this was going to happen. So I'm really kind of at a loss here at all this could have been avoided if we had, there have been, as Ben was saying, there have been, countless presentations to the community, countless documents that have been written. It's all there. It's all on the county's, or all on the Watershed Council's website. All of this stuff is available for people. And it's not our responsibility to, when we want to come to these meetings, we want to have productive conversation. We need to have, we all need to do a little bit of our own homework so that we can have these conversations. But, Mark, if you have a problem with OWRD trying to run the agenda, and then you also have a problem with irrigators and groundwater users, when their input is when they're given a soapbox to bring their input to the table, you have a problem with both ways, then how are we gonna move forward at all if there is no way forward? That's the only two ways that we can move forward is, and get this dialogue. It's gotta start somewhere.
Brandon, I appreciate that, thank you. And we have had a lot of conversations in 9 years. And a lot of people are trying to get up to speed now. And maybe my blood pressure got up a little high, but trying to get a basic understanding to those that are gonna be affected now in the community, I think is good. And when Ivan said in 3 weeks, come back with solutions, maybe I took that wrong. I would hope the question would maybe in 3 weeks, we can get back to seeing where the zone of agreements are, having questions where the policy decisions could be, and then we could have influx on those policy decisions. Because I still think there's a lot of questions on that, Brandon, on how we could actually effectively come up and propose solutions without having a full understanding of those irrigators in that room. Because I've been trying extensively now for about 8 weeks to figure out how to communicate this with the spreadsheets, with the department making memos, because we got a lot of people that weren't there because they wanted to know what the state was gonna do. And now we're starting to get a picture of what the state wants to do. And I'm trying to bridge that gap of how to communicate with irrigators, how to communicate with the community and provide solutions to the department. And I'm struggling with that. And I think the whole community's struggling with that. And honestly, I think the department's struggling with that. So I wanted to tell you, thank you. I'll come with a little cooler head. I have an all chat, and maybe we can figure out what is an effective measure to do in 3 weeks instead of yelling at each other. So thanks, Brendan.
Sounds good. Lisa, go right ahead.
Yeah, I guess I would just echo some of Brandon's comments as well as Ben's comments. And I do appreciate the importance of everybody understanding data and making an effort to understand the data and use the resources that are available to understand that. But I do bristle at the suggestion that there's been no notice to the community or the irrigators that we have severe problems with declining groundwater levels there and over appropriation. I mean, there was the 2015 meeting that somebody already referenced. There was some I think it was 2017 and 2019 maybe, when WRD put out press releases and I think sent letters saying, hey, you should really stop developing your undeveloped permits because we're headed for, critical groundwater area. We've obviously had this ongoing collaborative process that started in 2016, I believe, that's been focusing on groundwater up until last year. There have been legislative hearings, there have been numerous informational hearings before the Water Resources Commission, and my understanding's been that there have been irrigator meetings on issues like voluntary agreements and groundwater markets. So I bristle at the suggestion that there hasn't been notice. I actually, it feels disingenuous to me to suggest that. So I hope we can kind of put our heads together on how to move this process forward without, suggesting that this is a brand new issue that people weren't aware of. And I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, I think that's something we can take into consideration to determine if, an information session or whatever form it takes isn't, it's for those that want to participate. And if you feel like you're informed,
And the body of record has been there for 9 years. It's detailed. The data there, I think most of the data is good. Do we all possibly need more data in different areas? Yeah. But the things we've talked about in the last 4 RAC meetings are interpretation for new PTW, 2018 PTW, administrative areas. That doesn't have a body of record. And that's where we're struggling.
And the other thing that I'm struggling with, I'll speak for myself, is who would have ever thought, yeah, we do know that the water table is dropping and that it needs to be worked on and corrected. We didn't know that we were gonna have to take an 81% cut. I mean, you know what I'm saying? I mean, doesn't that seem a little extreme?
That's why we want to know where
That's why we brought this to the table, is because this was as shocking to us as maybe it was you. I don't know, maybe you knew all along. That you were gonna turn every pivot off in Crane to 12. You know what I'm saying? That's a little shocking. So at that point, it becomes time to ask some questions.
Absolutely. Okay, hold on. I got both of you and we're gonna get to it and I think probably.
I guess my point is, we didn't come here to do that.
What I anticipate is we'll take a quick break and we're gonna continue this conversation. We want to make sure these questions get answered. We just want to determine how best to utilize what we have set for the agenda, if in what form, if at all, if in pieces. So give us 10 minutes. 3.
Do that. Hi, this is Cheryl. I can't hear anything.
They're taking a break. I don't know if you guys heard that, like 10 or 15 minutes, I think, and then they'll come back.
Thank you. I missed it.
We are. Okay, let's all grab our seat. RAC members, please come on back. All right, if anybody can grab their chair, go ahead and get started. Okay, I got a microphone now. I understand there's some folks in the back that had some trouble hearing, so hopefully this helps out. Okay,
What's that?
yeah, got it. All right, well, we'll try to utilize this a little bit more than we have in the past. Okay, so thanks for coming back. Appreciate everybody's flexibility with the agenda. We take a look at it. I think we want to be responsive to your questions and concerns. So what we're gonna do is restructure this a little bit. We're going to, I mean, you have a copy of the agenda there in front of you, but we're kind of blowing it up. We're gonna go to the sub-basin approach conversation. This is the presentation Tim's gonna do. This was in direct response to some questions that the RAC provided to the department that they provided some feedback about. So we want to make sure we get that information back out to the RAC members. We're gonna take that and then move on to the community efforts for groundwater discussion. And then close out with a fiscal impact discussion if there's time. The most important thing we want to be able to do is spend this time on that sub-basin approach and then make sure we have time for the community efforts for groundwater. So that's the agenda now. We're not gonna get into the rulemaking now, recognizing that there's a lot of conversation and a lot of education and information that needs to be shared and discussed and vetted prior to getting into that rules conversation. So after this meeting with the department, we'll take a fresh look at the next agenda, make sure it's reflective of the interests and concerns and questions that you presented to us today. Okay? So let's go ahead. I'm gonna turn it over to Tim. He's gonna take over the sub-basin approach to PTW. Again, this is in response to some of the questions that you fed to the department since the last week.
You want me to use the mic?
Yeah.
So actually, I'm not gonna be the one presenting most of this. I'm gonna turn over to Dark, who is remote today, unfortunately, but he will hopefully be able to get the presentation up and going. And go from there. But first thing I wanted to start with was talking about some of the information we have made available online. So on our website, our rulemaking website, we have all of the past documents, all of the past presentations, and all of the past recordings from these meetings where we have gone through all of this information and tried to explain it as best we can and make it available to you. So that is a great resource for helping you all understand some of these concepts we talked about. We also have informational sessions up there that we've done where we go into the details of the groundwater study. We go into the details of a critical groundwater area rulemaking process. So I would ask that you all take the time to go watch some of those presentations, look through that material, and try to understand it. And then I think Ivan set the 3-week deadline. Suggestion. And it would be great if we could get questions back from you all. And those questions in the form of email or phone calls, however you need to. Kelly is the primary point of contact. I'm happy to hand out my business card as well. You can reach out to me, call me, email me, and we can start to put together all of that information or all of those questions so that we can start to figure out how to answer that and get your questions answered effectively and communicate in a way that we can all come to a shared understanding of where we are and how we move forward. Feel like there was something else I was supposed to mention.
Okay, so I have a question. This is not just for the RAC, this is for everybody in the back as well. So we have done informational sessions, we have recordings, all the things that Tim has said. What is the best way to get information to you guys? It's clearly we are not doing well on that front. Can you guys give us suggestions, like how do we get information to you? How do we get this in front of you? And that's what I'm hearing a lot, is that we're not getting this information, or this is all new to us. So if there are any suggestions, I'm not putting you on the spot right now. If you want to come talk to me and give us suggestions on how to get the information, I would love to hear it. Oh, yes, please.
I just have one, because, I probably spent an hour or better of my time trying to find some of this information that you're talking about. It's typical of a lot of websites. You go to the homepage, then you go there, and then I find stuff about Klamath Water Basin, and I try to search on Harney Basin, and I don't get there, and it took me a long time to get to the data. So whoever your webpage developer is, needs to make it real simple that you search for Harney County Basin, you go there, and there's just a list of the documents. I had to go to page, had to go to this one, find that, search by numbers. I had a really tough time getting more information.
I had the same experience, and without an email from a direct, like, RAC member committee, like, it was very difficult to find without a direct link. So I got an email forwarded from a RAC member that had the actual, like, direct link in it, and then once I had it, it was very easy to access the information. But same story, I Googled, and it was very, very difficult to find.
Gotcha, we don't want to make our information mysterious to find, so we're trying to make that as clear as possible on our website.
Is it unreasonable just to send information to every registered water right user? I've never received one drop of information. I'm a certified water right user in the county, never received one drop. Send it to every one of them.
Okay, I hear you, I don't know if it's unreasonable or not, but I will write that down, thank you.
We'll capture all things. So I hand that back there.
Yeah, I had trouble finding, determining which of the data points that the department decided to use in their study, and which they threw out, or if they used all of them, to kind of get an idea where they're coming from.
Gotcha, okay, thank you, so, transparency of the numbers, what do we use, what do we not use, correct? Okay, thank you.
Any accuracy assessments and confidence intervals and samples and things like that. So we know, I mean, it's all we have, we get that, but still knowing how good the data are is really important, and if you're gonna use it to make decisions.
Okay, heard you, thank you, yes.
Some of us in Harney County have very, very bad Wi-Fi. So I was just jumping on this gentleman's comment about if we could send something out at least once before we start making the rules. Just a, suggestion.
Sure, yeah, or find a way to get printed documents or
Right.
stuff, yeah,
Right.
understood, yeah, okay. If you have more, I'm not hearing any more questions, but if you have any more comments, or if you have ideas, come talk to me. My name is on the website, which is, I guess, is hard to find, so come talk to me and please give me your suggestions. Thank you.
You can make sure and put contact information up here at the end too.
Yep.
All right, so the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna go through, what's labeled the sub-basin approach on the agenda. And before I turn it over to Dark, I just want to set this up a little bit. So in the last RAC meeting, we talked through our approach for how we determine PTW and how that was determined for each sub area within the critical groundwater area, or the proposed critical groundwater area. And that was based on 15 sub areas, some of those being relatively small, others being much larger, but all of those being determined based on the criteria that we come up with and presented here in the RAC, I believe in RAC number 2 and RAC number 3. One of the questions that was presented, or that was asked in the last RAC meeting was, well, what happens if you use larger sub areas And so we spent the last, well, 4 weeks after, the 4 weeks immediately following the last RAC meeting, preparing essentially this presentation that Dark's about to give. And that was in direct response to the question posed by a RAC member here. And we really wanted to highlight why it helps highlight why we're taking the approach we're trying to take, and shows you all what the other option could look like. So Dark, if you're ready, I'll let you take it from there.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Let me try to share my screen here. Kelly, are you sharing yours? Here we go. In the room, are you seeing a screen with a map on it?
Yes.
Yes.
No. I have to, sorry, we're working with the sound in here because we got a big room and we need to make sure we're making
No.
I was gonna attempt to. I think I just unmuted it. All right. Dark, go ahead and say something. We're just testing the volume.
Okay, mic check here. Do you hear me?
Keep going, start.
Yep, testing.
Is that okay in the back?
Am I coming through clear?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got audio. Let me verify that you're seeing my shared screen there in the room. Zoom is telling me that I'm sharing currently.
We are seeing your shared screen.
Part of it.
You're seeing the interactive mapper there, Kelly?
Yes, we are.
Okay, great. So like Tim said, I'm going to proceed with my presentation on this, what we're calling the sub-basin approach to PTW. But before I get into that, I just want to step back and just mention another resource that the department has made available. And I think it was in response to some requests from RAC members at maybe RAC 2 or 3. They said, hey, is there an easy way the department can share with the RAC and with the public some of this data that you're talking about? And we turned around and we created an online web map, and that's what we're looking at here. So right here, we're showing some administrative boundaries. This dark blue line is the Malheur Lake Administrative Basin. This lighter blue line here, green line, is the Harney Basin. And this pink line here is the Greater Harney Valley Groundwater Area of Concern. That's our current classified area in the basin, and it's our proposed boundary for the critical area as well. So in addition to just some of the basic boundaries, we also can pull up things like our 15 proposed sub areas, and you can zoom in and take a look at, some of those boundaries as well. You can pull up, for example, the groundwater level contours from the groundwater study. You can pull up groundwater level trends. So this is a data set depicting the magnitude of decline, and this is a data set depicting the rate of decline for individual wells across the basin. You can pull up geology layers. You can pull up well sites, and if you click on them, I believe you can pull up a hydrograph here, and that'll take you to the water level record for any of those wells. So a lot of data available here. I'll continue going down the list just to give you a more full sense of what's available. We've got the groundwater use data. So that's the satellite-based evapotranspiration based pumpage estimates that we made as a part of the groundwater study. We also have somewhere on here, water rights information. So you can pull up the authorized points of appropriation, as well as the place of use polygons. And I'm not sure why those aren't coming up live. Oh, here we go. So you can see all of the individual water rights, and similarly, you can click on those and pull up the water right information. Here's the permit number, for example. So all of that information is available to the public. I'm not sure the best way to share the link. I believe it is on our rulemaking webpage, a link to this site. And I would encourage anybody, both the RAC members, members of the public, other interested parties, get in here and poke around. And you might have questions that you're not quite sure how to frame them. And maybe if you dig around into the data, it'll help you kind of clarify how best to ask the specific questions that you're looking for answers to. So I just wanted to share that. I will move to the presentation now. And Kelly, can I confirm that you're seeing the presentation in the room now?
We are, yes.
Wonderful. Okay. So like Tim mentioned, in our last meeting, we presented to the RAC our permissible total withdrawal, or PTW values, based on our proposed approach. That's the 15 sub-area approach. After that presentation, some members of the RAC requested that we present some alternate approaches. So members of the RAC proposed that we present PTW values based on, for example, 3 large subbasins instead of these 15 sub-areas. So the presentation here today will provide those PTW values based on one possible approach to dividing the critical area into these larger subbasins. And I'll say that this example is provided here for information purposes to respond to that question. It's not something that the department is recommending. And in addition to that, there are some additional issues that arise with these larger subbasins that would need to be thought through if this type of approach were to be applied in the basin. So the first step in any delineation across an area is, how do we draw these lines? What are the criteria we use to delineate, in this case, what we're calling subbasins? So the map shown here is from the department's 1967 report on the Malheur Lake Administrative Basin. So the Harney Basin, which represents the northern half of the administrative basin, is made up of the 3 surface water subbasins, as shown on the map here. And those are 1, the Sylvies, 2, the Donner and Blitzen, and 3, Silver Creek. So those are our 3 major surface water drainage subbasins in the Harney Basin. Several RAC members have proposed that instead of these 15 sub-areas, we instead use these 3 larger surface water subbasins to manage the groundwater level declines across the basin. So continuing with our delineation conversation here, the first map here on the left, we're going to move from left to right as we think about the process of delineating these subbasins. The first map is, again, the 15 sub-areas that the department has currently proposed for groundwater management in the critical area. In the middle map, we have some additional layers laid on top of that. We've got the USGS watershed boundary data set. These are the surface water drainage divides. Those are shown in red, and they're covered up in most places by another suggested data set that we might use to delineate these subbasins, and that is the water budget regions from the groundwater study. So these water budget regions were delineated to help analyze and discuss and communicate the different components of the water budget that we built out as a part of the groundwater study. You'll see still on this middle map that in most places, the water budget regions and the watershed boundaries coincide. They overlap almost perfectly, with the exception of kind of there in the center of the basin where you see the water budget regions kind of cutting across Malheur Lake there. And that was primarily due to the fact that we're thinking in terms of the groundwater budget, we're thinking in terms of groundwater flow. And again, the watershed boundary data set is really just a surface water divide. So we can take a look at those two boundaries, the water budget regions and the surface water boundaries. And we can come up with some examples of how we might group our 15 sub areas together within the constraints of those boundaries. So that third map on the right is one example of how we might do that, how we might take our 15 sub areas and group them into larger sub basins based on these other boundary data sets. So we'll take a little closer look at that. And here is that example, and this is the example we'll be moving forward with in this presentation. So in this particular example, we end up with 5 areas or sub-basins. You'll notice that Weaver Springs and Malheur Lake remain separate in this example. And this is for a couple of reasons. There seemed to be widespread agreement amongst RAC members at our last meeting that the hydrogeologic characteristics and the groundwater conditions in the Weaver Springs sub-area were unique from the rest of the critical area and should remain separate from these 3 larger sub-basins. So there was widespread agreement, and it's clear that the declines there are more severe than much of the rest of the basin. In this particular example that I'm presenting here, the Malheur Lake sub-area also remains separate, as it represents this area in the basin where groundwater flow converges at the center of the basin. And it's not really appropriate to lump it either with what we're calling here the north sub-basin or the south sub-basin. It really is that kind of central focus point where groundwater flow is converging. So we end up with 5 areas or sub-basins, and they're listed here with their component sub-areas. Notice here that the north sub-basin is made up of 9 sub-areas, some of which are what we've called our high priority sub-areas. Those are areas with more significant declines. And some of those 9 are what we've called the lower priority sub-areas. These are areas with less severe declines. So we've lumped kind of a combination of decline severity into this north sub-basin.
Sorry, real quick, just like pause for a second, just check in with everybody as far as what's being presented so far and questions about what you see.
I just got the one question I'm gonna ask you like I did last time. I don't understand why they're separating Dog Mountain and Weaver Springs. I mean, I don't understand why they've got those 2 separated. I just don't get it. If you look at Dog Mountain, you can see that rock that goes right around there and everything that runs right, I mean, in my opinion, those 2 should not be separated.
Okay, we'll capture that and you can make sure we get that in. Anybody else questions just about the methodology, where the data came from? Okay, Eric, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Bryant. So now we've delineated our sub-basins. The next step in moving towards calculating or estimating the PTW is we have to ask the question, what is the level of pumpage that will result in stable groundwater levels across these sub-basins? And we kind of have to go back to our last RAC meeting and some of the concepts and figures that we presented there. And this table and this plot are directly from my presentation from our last meeting. So remember that in the north sub-basin, we've grouped together both high and lower priority sub-areas. And we know that some of these sub-areas have significantly more severe declines than others. So remembering back to our goal with these PTW values, and that's to achieve stable water levels, even in those areas with the highest rates and magnitudes of decline. So we have to ensure that pumpage in those worst declining areas is pulled back to the level that will result in stable groundwater levels in those areas. So again, to these figures on the screen, these are from our last meeting. And if you recall, they showed us that in the Crane area, our approach shows that we need to see pumpage levels from around 1987 to achieve stable groundwater levels in this Crane area. And what that means in the case of this larger north sub-basin is that we'd have to pull the entire sub-basin back to approximately 1987 pumpage to achieve stability in that crane area where we've seen the longest declines occurring. So grouping together both these high and lower priority sub areas essentially means that we need to pull the entire area, this entire grouped area, back to the pumpage level that will ensure that we result in stable groundwater levels in those areas with the worst declines.
Question, Garth?
So thanks, Gark, and so I think this starts across into policy also. And I think when we talk about the definition of reasonably stable, it goes to the conversation we had in the last RAC. Is when we were looking at the sub areas, that maybe we could use the medium across multiple of the administrative areas to come up with a medium for the whole area, not going to the most acute problem. Because right now you're going to the most acute problem in Crane and using that to set PTW in a larger area by a policy decision that you want zero rate of decline in the worst area in a whole hydrographic area. I don't think that's maybe a policy, that's a policy decision we should discuss as a group. Because I think that's what takes your PTW to 26,000 acre feet less. And it's not what we discussed in the last RAC. I remember Zach specifically asking, could we use a medium hydrograph for the area instead of a crane?
Thanks for that comment.
And it's a follow-up question too, Tim, it's just not a comment. It's to put down for discussion. Otherwise, I'm going to be at the same point I was at the beginning of this meeting, at the beginning of the next meeting.
So can you help me by restating your question? Just the question.
So I'm assuming the department made a policy decision to use just the medium of crane.
Correct.
To be extrapolated over the whole northern unit.
Correct.
Off a policy decision that now we're gonna have reasonably stable, meaning zero rate of decline in the most acute problem in the whole basin.
Correct.
Okay, so those are policy discussions that this group should be able to discuss because they directly relate or correlate to the PTW that was developed.
Okay. So we can put that down as something we'll discuss in the future.
Can I add a piece to that? This is, when we talk to the people in Umatilla, they went through the process of removing irrigation and not taking water out. And they have no evidence that suggests that improved anyone's water. And I talked to the hydrogeologist that's a researcher in the USDA Agricultural Research Service and asked them some questions about some of the things that we're doing here. And they told me that it's almost impossible to know what is going on. Do we have an adequate characterization of what the water and the water flow actually is? Because if you're talking about making that kind of a cut in that area, we need to be really, really sure. You can't just take 5 days during a drought period or 5 years or 10 years and then start taking 81%, knocking these guys out. We need an approach that has to be much more iterative and much more carefully thought out, much more carefully tried. We're managing under uncertainty. And in that case, we need a constant monitoring system and we need to slowly tiptoe into our ideas so we can see how they're responding and change them if they do or they don't work. So that's just the basic question that I have is, how comfortable are you that in fact reducing these takeout of water is actually going to affect the water level? And from the researchers that I talked to, they say this is much, much more complicated than just irrigation use. And so I don't know. Do you have other examples of in Oregon where this has worked? Because Umatilla people say it didn't.
So thank you for your comment, Robert. First thing I will note is that the Umatilla Basin is a very different hydrogeologic setting than the Harney. You have confined aquifers and basalt that are not receiving recharge. Here, we receive recharge. So it's completely different situations.
But we still don't have any evidence that it actually works.
It works.
There's evidence, water level decline rates slowed down in the basalts in
Yeah.
Umatilla.
And reducing use resulted in water level declines slowing.
Okay.
The next piece. We spent 6 years with the USGS on a groundwater study, and that data was not just the 6 years in which we performed the study. The data that was used was all available data, going back in the water level record as far as we had the ability to go. That entire process was done in collaboration with USGS, and all of the reports were peer reviewed by USGS scientists. I have the utmost confidence in that process and in the reports that were produced.
And so you think the data that they collected was good? I mean, you're using other people's collected data, and I'm wondering.
Well, since much of that collected data was also collected by USGS staff and trained OWRD hydrogeologists, yes.
And what about
It's the
the
best we
idea
have.
of moving much more slowly and not impacting the whole world and continuing the investigation so that we make sure we're headed an appropriate direction before we tear the system apart?
So I think that's exactly the approach we're laying out as we talk about 15 sub areas. Is we're talking about, rather than applying these curtailments across the entire area, we are talking about starting with focus in these high priority sub areas where the most severe declines occur. And what we're getting to here very shortly is how much more impacting we would have to be because of the prior appropriation in order to halt the declines in these deep cones of depression, which are surrounded by our sub areas, our high priority sub areas. The only way to halt those declines is to reduce pumping in those specific areas. So reducing pumping out in Upper Silver Creek is not going to have a timely effect on groundwater level declines in Crane. And that's what we're trying to get at here and make clear. And I want to ask Darek if I said anything wrong there, because I'm not the hydrogeologist, he's the scientist. So how did you feel about my answer, Darek?
No, that was great, Tim. And I did want to make sure we made the point that even up in Umatilla, even in our Columbia River basalt aquifers that see very little recharge, when we implemented those curtailment measures back in the 90s, we did see that rate of decline slow. Now, the declines haven't stopped there. And then that begs the question, well, how much more curtailment would be needed to stop that? But it's clear that reducing pumpage reduced the declines. And there's no reason to expect that that's not exactly the type of response we're going to see here in the Harney Basin.
Thank you.
Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I put my hand up a little while ago, so I've been accumulating a few comments along the way. I wanted to say to Mark's point about this, being a policy call. It is in statute, right, that we are supposed to be maintaining reasonably stable groundwater levels and assuring drinking water for, groundwater for domestic use, human consumption, I think is the term. So, that is not a policy call, that is a requirement. And so I think it's important to keep those separate or clear. And on the Umatilla, I agree it's a different kind of system. But I think if anything, what that experience suggests is that we should not be timid at the beginning about, controlling groundwater pumping. That if we want to have success here, we really do need to kind of say what we mean and have measures that get us to where we need to be. To that end, I guess, I don't know if this may be out of order, but I do think that, for the other sub areas, in order to, make sure we don't have kind of a Umatilla type experience where we never quite get to the target. It would be important to have like some date certain, triggers for action there. As we see what happens to the groundwater levels. And I would agree with that, comment that, I don't think it's that mysterious what's happening. I mean, we can measure in the Harney, we can see the groundwater levels declining in direct response to like the amount of pumping that's happening in different areas. So I don't think it is complex, but I don't think it's like a big mysterious black box. I mean, I think it is a pretty clear relationship. So that's all. Thanks for hearing my comment.
Thank you. Okay. Dart, go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. So let's jump into the numbers here. This table shows the comparison of the PTW values using this sub-basin approach versus the PTW values from our sub-area approach. So the column of values, that left column of values, is the PTW value from the sub-basin approach. And the column on the right represents the sum of the PTW values for those sub-areas that were grouped to form each of these sub-basins. So you can kind of make a comparison of what this alternate approach means in relation to what the department is proposing with our 15 sub-areas. So in the west and south sub-basin, it really is just it's just the sum of the 2018 pumpage-based PTW from our 15 sub-area approach. So this really represents essentially no change from the 15 sub-area approach that we're proposing. Weaver Springs and Malheur Lake, similarly, no change. It's basically a 1-to-1. But in the north sub-basin, this sub-basin approach results in a PTW value that is 26,000 acre feet lower than what the department is proposing for our 15 sub-area approach. Again, this is because of the limitations, the pumping limitations required to achieve stable groundwater levels in those areas where the declines are the most severe. And in this case, we're talking about the Crane area being the limiting factor. So overall, with the sub-basin approach example, the PTW across the entire critical area is 26,000 acre feet lower than what we're currently proposing with the 15 sub-area approach. And the next couple of slides are just a couple of additional ways we can look at these numbers. So this figure shows, again, this comparison between the sub-basin approach and our sub-area approach, this time looking just at that north sub-basin. So the bar on the left, the yellow bar, is the PTW from this sub-basin approach. And the bar on the right, the blue bar, is the sum of the 9 component sub-areas, the sum of the PTW for those 9 sub-areas from the department's proposed approach. And note here for comparison purposes too, that the gray bar represents the 2018 pumpage estimate. Again, just demonstrating that the sub-basin approach, PTW, is 26,000 acre feet lower than the sum of those 9 PTW values from the department's proposed approach. I will note here that in this particular example, we used the pumpage year 1990 for the Crane area and applied this pumpage limit across the entire north sub-basin. And 1990 does represent a somewhat larger annual pumpage than what we're proposing in our current PTW approach. But it's used here to demonstrate that even with a somewhat larger allowance for pumpage in the Crane area than we're proposing, the overall sub-basin PTW is still significantly lower than our current 15 sub-area approach. This next plot is just another way to think about the differences between the two approaches, specifically in this north sub-basin. So this plot shows the comparison of PTW values using the sub-basin approach versus the sub-area approach. And this plot breaks it back down into the 9 individual sub-areas that were grouped to form the north sub-basin. So this should help allow for kind of a direct comparison of how these differences kind of translate across the landscape. And again, here, the gray bar represents the 2018 pumpage, sorry, for these areas. So did I hear a question in the room?
No.
Okay, sorry. So these break down differently depending on the sub area. So for the lower priority sub areas within the North Subbasin, Windy Point, Sylvies, Poison Creek, Rattlesnake Creek, and Crane Buchanan, you can see the PTW from the subbasin approach is significantly lower than the department's current proposal, which is that of PTW values set right at that 2018 pumpage level. For the high priority sub areas within the North Subbasin, the comparison is variable. The PTW for Rock Creek and North Harney are somewhat lower than the department's current proposed value. The PTW for Lawen and Dog Mountain are unchanged, and the PTW for the Crane sub area is slightly higher, again, because for this particular example, we chose to use the 1990 pumpage just for demonstration purposes. This is my last slide, and I just want to say kind of the main takeaway here is that to achieve our stated goal of stabilizing groundwater levels across the basin, the subbasin approach for groundwater management is going to require a lower overall PTW for the entire critical area. With those PTW reductions in this example focused on the North Subbasin, where we've grouped together both high priority and lower priority sub areas together. So in general, the larger the management area that we're dealing with, and especially in cases where we're grouping together areas that have variable severity of declines, the larger those areas are, the smaller the PTW value is going to have to be overall to achieve stable groundwater levels in those areas where we have the most severe declines. So that's all I have on this example today, and happy to take questions either now or written questions down the road if they come up once you've had a little time to think about this.
Okay, look at the RAC first. There is a question from the public, and I think we'll probably allow that today. There's definitely a lot of interest there, but from the RAC, I guess questions about the data. Understanding there's been some feedback about the decision-making process that goes into some of these calculations at a policy level. Questions about the data that was presented. So
I guess I do have one question.
Yep.
So Derek was showing that graph that showed the different layers of how that's made. And years ago, I got together and did this class on how to, go through all these different web pages and different things. But I'm not sure I can figure out how to do that, how to work my way through that. So which one of you guys are gonna get the phone call?
Oh, Kelly,
Is that Kelly?
if he can't figure it out, he'll get it to the person who can.
Okay.
So a question I also have for the RAC, looking forward to, the next RAC meeting or whatever format, some information session might take. What from this do we need to take a step back on, or to make sure people understand or are educated on the conversation regarding that? And I do see your hand. I just want to make sure I get the RAC questions. Yeah.
What assumptions in time frame relative to hydrogeological properties in the larger area was, there had to be a time frame projected to come up with that differential that is showed in the graphs. Time frame of hydrological water levels.
Gotcha. Dark, did you hear that question, or did you want me to try to fix that up first?
I think Fred was asking about projected timeframes for achieving stable water levels. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think let me restate it, Fred, and you
go
can
ahead.
tell me if it makes sense, but I think what you're getting at is what was the time frame we used for establishing what was stable water levels, and how did we project back and decide that 1987 was the pumpage value that should result in stable water levels within that area? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, and
And
the difference from
and how that differs between the two approaches?
small area to
Yeah.
the larger area.
Okay. Does that make sense, Dark?
I think so. So Fred, this approach that I presented today is really building off of my presentation from our last meeting, where I presented, if you'll recall, what we called our hydrograph approach to PTW. So that's where we're taking water level trends and projecting them back to a period that represented a time when groundwater levels were stable in the basin. And that baseline stable level that we used for that approach, if you'll remember, was based off of that 1969, that spring of 1969 water level data that we had to project back to. So that didn't change in this approach. And really, we used the same PTW, what we call the inflection point year for that hydrograph approach. We used those same values in this example, this sub-basin example that I presented today. So as far as stepping back into kind of the process leading up to the PTW, that approach didn't change whatsoever. It really was the same approach that I presented on at our last meeting.
But you have a water level change associated with a certain period of time. If you're close to, like in a small, one of the 15 sub areas, the time frame is short in terms of the response to decreased pumping. When you move out further from that area, then there is a very large differential in time frame, and it tends to be aquifer specific in terms of time frame. I'm not clear on what your answer was relative to that point, Guy.
Okay, so I think you are asking about what might be some projections into the future where we would expect these pumping reductions to result in stable water levels. And we've discussed this some. We've discussed the limitations in our ability to predict that. That is certainly one area where the groundwater flow model can really help us answer these timing questions. But you are right, Fred. Different parts of the basin are going to respond differently as far as that timing of response piece. And that comes down to, like you said, the aquifer properties in those different areas, as well as how severe the declines are up to this point. All that's going to come in and complicate, those stories. But the groundwater model is a tool that can help us put some sideboards on that timing question.
And you're working from an assumption, not necessarily a measured connection in one aquifer to another in estimating that time frame. Because what we're talking about, just to boil it back to a different issue, you have a set of regulations going in and you want a X amount of change in a certain period of time. And that's supposed to match up to the hydrological properties where when you regulate one area, your expectation of change has to be consistent or whatever with hydrological, geological properties. But anyway, you answered it for you. Okay, Mark.
So, I mean, this might be appropriate for next meeting when we talk about some of these policy decisions. But I mean, I would throw out a thought that if Crane area could drop a total of 4 inches a year for the next 30 years, which would be a 10-foot total decline in that area, would the rest of the north unit become reasonably stable? And how would that dramatically change the PTW? Because if you got 90% of the sub area at zero rate decline, and one would infer, in my mind, that reasonable of a 10-foot decline for the next 30 years could be a reasonable trade-off between economic, ecological, and social. And we could look at the domestic wells in that area and provide any assistance to drill them however much farther they would need to go in order to just compensate that 10 feet. It might buy a lot more production in a 30-year period of time. And it might be considered reasonable to most if we can make sure the domestic and ecological issues are covered. But we would know the full extent of decline would only be 10 more feet.
First, was there a question there?
Yeah, I mean, can the department be willing to have that conversation and once again do the math on something like those scenarios? I think that's where we get to, is that we're gonna have conversation of policy, we're gonna have to run different scenarios.
That's where the model comes in.
Okay, so the second thing I heard there, that I just want to make sure I understand, is you said 0.4 inches per year of decline.
4 inches.
4 inches, sorry, 4 inches a year of decline. I misspoke.
Times 10 is 120, or times
Sure, yeah.
30 is 120.
Totally.
So it's 10 foot further decline in 30 years.
Yep, even I can do that math in my head. That makes sense. I would want to first go back and look at the decline trends that we have for Crane and validate that, because I don't remember those off the top of my
They're
head.
about a foot.
What?
They're about a foot.
Okay. So you're saying Crane should reduce use to get to 0.4, or sorry, 4, yeah, sorry. 0.3 feet per year, 4 inches. And if that happens, then we're managing declines rather than halting them.
We're managing declines in a specific area, maybe halting in the rest of that northern subbasin.
And then what you're asking is, can we then extrapolate what the effect of that is on the surrounding subareas? And if that will help overall achieve our intended goal of halting declines in the long term. Did I capture that correctly?
Close.
Okay.
I mean, it just, if we get into, you know, our goal, I mean, it's the department's goal right now is zero rate decline across every inch of that basin. Mine is there an acceptance in a small area where we can have, yes, Lisa, a controlled depletion for 10 more feet, but the rest gets to reasonably stable quickly. And we can mitigate that 10-foot response for ecological and domestic use. I think it might dramatically change the PTW in that whole area.
Okay. So I think
We can talk later and, yeah.
I think I understand. I don't know that we're ready to answer that question now, and we're gonna need to take that down and follow.
Yeah, Mark, the other aspect of that I'd ask you to consider is how fast do you get from today at a foot per year decline to 4 inches? Because that really is a key question. And that's the kind of feedback that we'll need, because that's all policy relative stuff.
That's where a model would sure be handy.
Sorry, let me check on that.
Well, we're capturing this, and that's good. I mean, these are kind of ideas, questions you need, so we can maybe bring that back and present it.
So. Because the level of information, the number of wells being monitored through static level testing in March is different from one area to the other. That if you make a reduction in any one area, the only way to monitor if it's being successful is a rate of decline change, which I assume, or the question is, how many years does that take? To me, it's 7 at least to 12. So when you implement a curtailment, if it's permanent, you're permanent. So you don't have a chance to adjust to the many different things the community is interested in doing to help the situation. So you need time to, do that. And so the question is number of years to really have good data. The second thing is, if our irrigation wells all took static water level measurements, if there's an incentive put forward helping them do that, wouldn't that be a lot better information to know if whatever we're doing is working, and how well it's working? In other words, right now, we have a lot of wells out there that aren't being monitored. In fact, there's some that have been discarded because it's hard to monitor, even at the state level monitoring. So my proposition, as you know, is always more data is better to get a clear picture of what's going on and the impacts of regulatory decisions.
Agreed, more data is always better. I guess the question I have, sort of back to you, Fred, is if we have a group of wells across a sub area, which is how we, one of the criteria we use for delineating sub areas, and those wells all track together, so we see changes year over year that are the same or very, very similar. How does adding another well into that group of wells that all track together substantially change our decision-making process?
I would throw it back and say, from the people I talk to, there is a lot of different data, even in problem areas, that suggest there's a differential on recharge. And there's a differential on declines. And so I always felt more is better. I mean, you guys are the analysts, and we've asked you about anomalies, and sometimes anomalies in a well can tell you more about all the other situations than not. In other words, an anomaly can be a separation in function. And that tells you a lot about maybe what you want to do. I mean, we do that on our own situation. We monitor 10 wells, and we monitor not just March static levels, but we look at pumping level changes during and after we shut down. So that information is really beneficial. And I know that we're talking about great big impacts, and I just want an incentive out there that we get better and more information, so we know what's being suggested is actually gonna work before we have those real life economic decisions that are life threatening, livelihood threatening, everybody life threatening in many cases. And I want that duration to match up to what's happening hydrogeologically speaking.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, I definitely hear the desire for more data. And I totally agree that more data could result in the sub area boundaries changing based on what we find in each individual point. And that is always, from my perspective, that extra data is always a good thing, and it would allow us to manage the system better. I agree with you. I don't know that, well, I know this RAC process doesn't have the ability to create an incentive for static water level measurements. We don't have any money we can put to that. So maybe that's something we could think about creatively in the rules, and we'll all need lots of help coming up with something. But if there's a way to incentivize in the rulemaking process additional static water level measurement gathering by users, thank you.
Okay, I got two hands in the back, and I think it's probably a good time to just shift to public comment, and you two can kick this off. So, 1 second, and I just want to get a show of hands. Anybody else want to provide public comment?
Two online.
You got 2 online, 2 in the room. Okay, those of you online, do you want to do your comment now, or at the end of the day. Raise your hand if you want to do it now, online. Okay, so Chris wants to do it now. So we're gonna do 3 public comments right now. That's about much time we have. Just a reminder, I know your comment may be a question, it may pertain to the topic we have here. However, overall, for a comment period, the department may or may not have the ability to respond to questions and comments because they're not prepared for it, but we will get answers ultimately. So actually gonna start, gentleman there, with not you, and then yes. Then we'll go over here, and we'll go to Chris online and just try to keep it to maybe 3 minutes or less.
Okay, so you will state your name.
Yeah, go ahead, please state your name.
So on Eric's conversation and stuff, or his study on the northern sub-basin, on the thing, he talks about just the crane cone of depression and stuff, and that's how he based everything off, and it did a different PTW on the stuff. If we're all hydraulically connected some way, did he not use an average through that whole region to come up with the thing? Because there's cones and depressions all over and different connections and everything. Why don't we use a median of, 10 wells up there to come up with that region all the way from the north end or whatever, instead of the worst scenario of basically, and maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I thought I understood, that he picked the cone of depression and crane, the worst one, to do that to show that the PTW, but if everything's hydraulic and connected, we're trying to recharge the aquifer. Shouldn't we recharge the whole thing and not base everything on that? Because we might be recharging, like this guy said, all those other cones of depressions, but we're basing it off that.
Thank you for your comment.
Yeah, thank you. We'll, like I said, we'll capture these, make sure that we're, these could be things that we're able to pull into this, presentation the next in discussion. Okay, right here.
My name is Ben Kerman, and we're the largest water user in Weaver Springs. And to Derek's comments, if I understood correctly, what he was saying is by having more sub areas, we're able to maintain a higher PTW, which made me ask the question that within Weaver Springs, specifically on the ground that we farm and try to irrigate, when we do our static level measurements, we notice that there's actually significantly different rates of decline in wells on one side of the ranch versus wells that sit on on the other side of another geological formation. So there's apparently some different hydrogeology going on there. And what I'm wondering is, would it be possible that to create a further sub area, even within the Weaver Springs area, looking at the hydrogeology there and saying, hey, there's some wells here that actually aren't declining nearly as rapidly as other areas. Because we don't deny that there's a significant decline. I mean, we live it every day, right? But we have areas where there isn't nearly as bad of a decline. So what are the options for addressing that? Is that a voluntary agreement? I haven't heard much discussed about the voluntary agreements. So that's a question. Is that an option to further divide within the Weaver Springs area? And then secondly, just a comment personally, not representing anybody, but just as an observer to this process. I moved here in 2019 and to be a farm manager for the family that owns the property. And Mark invited me to these water meetings to come and participate, and I've been to most of them. And I've read the groundwater study report after it came out, and I've tried to keep myself as informed as possible. And I would, to a couple of points that have been made here today. Yes, it's true that water users have not always participated in these. I've been here and I've seen, and I've wondered why hasn't there been more irrigators show up at these meetings. So that's a fair comment and criticism. But the other side of that, where, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. Tim, you seem to be a little baffled as to, where's all this, why there's so many people here today and where's this coming from? You've done all this groundwork. It's true. You guys have done a lot of groundwork. But it wasn't until recently, literally within the past few weeks, that we had any idea the severity of the level of curtailment. That was news to everybody. And because we had, like I said, been to most of these meetings, the number, we threw around maybe 30%, maybe 50% when we were Springs, nobody really knew. But then to throw out a number of 74%, I mean, my goodness, you want to talk about causing a panic. That's exactly what's happened and caused a major level of uncertainty. So I think it's a little bit unfair to pretend that, that well, maybe not pretending. I don't want to question your sincerity. I know you guys are all sincere, but really that information is new. And that's why you have so many people here, trying to figure out just what the heck is going on. Because it was a surprise. So I was
Can I ask Ben a question?
Well, let's wait on that because we got another public comment period and there's one more public comment and then we want to take a short break. So, but at break, definitely ask some questions. Chris, Paul.
Good afternoon. My name is Christopher Hall, Executive Director of Water League. Thank you for this opportunity to comment on the proceedings. I was quite caught off guard at the beginning for like the first hour, where it seemed like the members of the RAC were concerned about understanding the process. It sounded like, unless I'm mistaken, it sounded like, the first 5 meetings in the past year just never even happened. Be that as it may, I've been at all of these meetings and I feel like this process has been fully transparent and I have had no problems understanding what's going on. I welcome anybody to give me a call if you have any questions. I'd be happy to help answer your questions as well. Insofar as this idea regarding sub-basins versus sub-area, if you look at that graph that Dark showed, and it had the North sub-basin with all of its constituent sub-areas listed in it. There were a number of yellow and blue lines, and you'll notice that only Crane is the one that increases the yellow line, whereas all the other ones, it decreased. And what that means is that if the department were to adopt the sub-basin approach, which actually I support, it would force the entire region to drop substantially the amount of pumping that they're allowed to do in order to make sure that the area in Crane maintained its groundwater levels without declining, which is what the statute requires. It's not a policy decision unless the elected legislators make a change in the statute. So I believe the Water Resource Department is pretty much locked into that by law. And so what happens is that the lowest common denominator, which is Crane, pretty much drags down everybody else. And I'm not quite sure I've ever seen such a brazen attack on the doctrine of prior appropriation. And to that degree, I kind of support this idea because I think that making decisions based on seniority oftentimes leaves a lot of other well-meaning and beneficial uses out in the cold. And so just, in terms of like making a decision as to whether they're going to go one way or the other, everybody should know that if you go with the sub-basin approach, you're giving your water to Crane. And if you go with the sub-area approach, then there's a lot less water that's being remained in the ground. And I think probably those low priority areas will become high priority areas sooner than later. So there's a lot to think about in this regard. And if you want to talk policy and making policy decisions, it's basically providing welfare to Crane, which is what the sub-basin area approach does. And it really, I mean, it's a direct attack against prior appropriation from what I can tell. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. We're gonna take a 5-minute break. So it's 3:35. We'll come back at 3:40. We'll transition over to our community efforts for groundwater. So please don't go too far, but we want to give a minute for swap out, change presenters here. So 5 minutes.
Don't let go. Maybe I go to the bathroom.
on track. Okay, everybody can come on back. I think, we want to go ahead and get started. We've got a limited time to wrap up our meeting today, so wrap up your conversation, find your way to your seat. Thank you. Okay, everybody, find your seat. We need to Okay, everybody, time to quiet down. We'll get your conversation. We need to move forward. Okay, so we're gonna keep going here. What we want to do now is shift the conversation a little bit. So, you know, the comment was made, the question came up about voluntary agreements. You know, that's sort of that's an indicator of some of the other half of this conversation. There's a regulatory piece that we've been discussing. It is a predominantly the goal of this RAC. There's a whole other half of this where we can provide, where there's opportunity for making decisions within the community to handle groundwater situation. So that's what we want to focus on now. That you can get that information, you can turn this over to Holly, and she's going to present that.
Can you hear me if I don't use my?
No, in the back.
Okay, well, hello, everybody, members of the RAC and members of the public. Thank you for letting me be here today. To talk with you about some efforts that have been ongoing in the community for quite some time. My name is Holly Mondo, and I've been the project manager of the Harney Community-Based Water Planning Collaborative for the last almost 5 years now. During this presentation, I'm not going to say that whole name the whole time, so I'm going to be referring to that as the collaborative. The purpose of my presentation today is to reorient this RAC to place-based planning, reintroduce the collaborative's efforts, and also encourage the RAC to utilize the contents of the groundwater plan that the collaborative has created. So to begin, I'm going to summarize both place-based planning and the Harney Collaborative's process. I'll share elements of the groundwater plan. I'll discuss options for reducing the rate of decline. I'll spend some time introducing voluntary agreements, and then I'll offer some key takeaways as my conclusions. As a quick recap to place-based planning, Oregon's 2012 Integrated Water Resources Strategy recommended that the department help places undertake a collaborative integrated approach to water planning. The department published draft planning guidelines in 2015 that provide a framework for place-based planning. Place-based planning is meant to be a voluntary, locally initiated and led effort involving a balanced representation of water interests who work in partnership with the state to understand and meet their in-stream and out-of-stream water needs. The county court and the watershed council saw this as an opportunity, saw this as an alignment of the stars. There were declining groundwater levels, a groundwater study in the works, and now the opportunity to apply for place-based water planning that was supported by OWRD. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to engage the community and provide them with some ownership for resolving groundwater issues they were experiencing in their own backyards. In 2015, the department received legislative authority and an initial funding of $750,000 to begin a water planning pilot phase. In 2016, 4 areas across the state of Oregon began testing the place-based planning guidelines, and Harney Basin was one of those places. We began in 2016, and OWRD has been a partner since then, providing us with technical, planning, and funding assistance. Under the department's guidance, each pilot group focused on this stepwise process. Step 1, build a collaborative that represents a diverse set of interests and build an inclusive process. Step 2, gather information to understand water resources and identify knowledge gaps. Step 3, examine current and future water needs. Step 4, identify solutions to meet water needs. And step 5, develop and implement an integrated water resources plan that encompasses both groundwater and surface water. During the collaborative process, we found that the department had missed some steps. We found that there needed to be a separate step to identify the critical water resource issues they wanted to focus on in their plan. So step 3.5 was born. And they also found that there needed to be a step dedicated to figuring out how to actually implement these solutions that we were developing. Thus, step 4.5. Those 2 steps that we identified, along with the department's 5, were imperative to the collaborative success. As you can probably assume, completing those 5, 7 place-based planning steps takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of perseverance by the collaborative members, and it takes a willingness for all of those people to find solutions that work for a wide range of interests. Place-based planning has been a very unique opportunity, and it's also been a huge commitment for those that have been involved. Really quick, I'd like to know in this room who has been involved in the Harney Collaborative here in this basin. Raise your hand super high. It takes commitment of members inside and outside of Harney County for this process to be successful. You saw multiple people raise their hands just now. These are community members, these are landowners, these are people that have domestic wells, these are representatives, these are people that work for the Watershed Council, these are people that live here, and these are people that live out of here that care about what happens in this basin. The folks that have been involved in our collaborative are pioneers, and they have done something out of the box to find well-rounded solutions to the groundwater issues that we are dealing with today. Those solutions are also supported by the department, and they're also supported by the Water Resources Commission. Going back to the topic of timing and alignment of the stars, in 2016, this community faced some huge major changes with the moratorium being placed on new groundwater permits. Information was becoming available regarding the dire groundwater situation. And knowing this, the collaborative chose to employ a phased approach to their planning process so they could focus on groundwater and the solutions to those groundwater issues. So phase 1. As I mentioned before, planning commenced in 2016 and wrapped up in 2022. And yes, that did take us a really long time to complete. The reasons why? We had a lot of kinks to work out in the place-based planning process. It took us a long time to figure out how best to engage this community, and it also took us a long time to find helpful and relevant information to help us actually identify the issues and solutions in this basin. Available information during that time frame was really sparse. That is until we received the OWRD and USGS groundwater study. We conducted our planning process in concert with OWRD and USGS conducting that study. And it was extremely challenging, but we did it. We sent out, circulated our groundwater plan, essentially at the same time that OWRD and USGS published their study. The groundwater study only confirmed what we already knew, and now we just had some data to back up what we were claiming in the groundwater plan. And to reemphasize, the OWRD USGS groundwater study ran parallel as a completely separate effort to the collaborative planning process. But that piece, that groundwater study was imperative for us to be here today. We're currently in phase 2 of our planning process, which is working through surface water issues. I won't get into too much of that today. And phase 3 will be when we actually integrate those groundwater plans and surface water plans together. And so how does this have to do with the RAC? In 2022, the collaborative finished their final draft of their groundwater plan, which includes solutions, creative solutions, to the issues that this RAC is having to deal with. Our plan has collaborative consensus. It successfully went through a special interagency review process, which included the department as a main reviewer. And as I decided, it'll go through a formal interagency process when we have an integrated plan. The Water Resources Commission, the County Court, the Burns Paiute Tribe, the Watershed Council are all familiar and supportive of the contents inside this groundwater plan. The commission has given an informal stamp of approval, which will be made formal once we bring them our integrated plan. So to crosswalk the efforts between the collaborative, the department, and the RAC process. The Water Collaborative based our entire planning approach on the notion that our groundwater plan would be utilized by this very RAC. We worked hard to get these stamps of approval. We worked hard to get these through the chain of command so that it would be ready to go and have community support during this process. So I'm here today to formally encourage and kindly urge you to please use it. Now, let's get into the elements of our groundwater plan. Jumping to step 3.5 of the place-based planning process, the collaborative identified issues that were generally categorized as the following: overallocation and groundwater level declines, ecosystem health and protection, water security for groundwater users, groundwater governance and accountability, infrastructure improvements and necessary upgrades, agricultural and community economic sustainability, climate change and climate cycles and their effects on groundwater, and incomplete information about groundwater conditions and resources. As we all know, groundwater cannot be directly observed. So the issues that are categorized in these buckets arose from direct effects felt by groundwater users, such as loss of domestic well production, loss of sufficient water to irrigate, and loss or reduction of production of stock water. The second way, lack of information on groundwater resources and its uses and management. And the third way, concerns about the management and equitable use of groundwater. After we identified these issues, we moved on to developing solutions and strategies to address those issues. The collaborative developed 31 strategies that focus on reducing the effects of overallocation and the use of groundwater to sustainable levels. It's more than a list of strategies. It's important to look at them as an integrated set of efforts. While each of the strategies that this collaborative developed, they represent a helpful groundwater management tool or application, they do not exist in the abstract or the alone. Their effectiveness is impacted by existing conditions of water availability, water allocation, water law, and customary uses. Additionally, while each of these individual strategies can improve groundwater management, none of these strategies alone can ensure groundwater uses will reach sustainable levels. Some of the strategies focus on addressing immediate effects of overallocation, while others try to address the root causes. It's important to highlight that the collaborative has already implemented strategies, even though we're still in the midst of planning, which is unique and not something that can be said about the other 3 pilot groups. I think that's a testament to this community and the hard work and willpower that they have. We have implemented a Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, or CREP. That came from the collaborative. That started with us. The Harney Domestic Well Remediation Fund that we'll hear about later this evening, that came from us too. The last one is that this collaborative is represented in this rulemaking process. There are members of the RAC that have been involved in the in the collaborative process. And the reason I'm here today is to remind you that this collaborative still needs representation, and also to thank you for letting me be here again today. Lastly, the collaborative has already explored groundwater markets and voluntary agreements. I'll mention that we did not get consensus or seek consensus as a group on either approach. But we do have a feasibility study on groundwater markets that's available for this RAC to utilize. And we do have an analysis on voluntary agreements that this RAC can utilize. I don't know what that means. I didn't put that on there. Okay, we'll get back to the collaborative strategies in just a moment. Excuse me. It is classified. You all have classification.
That's my computer. Just.
We all have security clearance now. Okay, we will get back to the collaborative strategies in just a moment. But I think now it's a good time to, again, link everything back together. During the last RAC meeting in January, we learned that OWRD sees two buckets that encompass options for reducing the rate of decline. The management bucket that we've been spending a lot of time on during this meeting, and also the voluntary bucket. These buckets are quite different, and they each pose their own set of questions, but it's possible that they can work together. Maybe they can coexist as two arms seeking to reach the same goal. Since we have received information on the options in the management bucket, let's chat about the voluntary bucket for now. Last meeting, the department shared that options in the voluntary bucket can be flexible and creative, which sounds a lot like what the collaborative has been working on. They shared that voluntary agreements can be made between sub-areas, which the collaborative has a whole analysis on that we'll talk about in a couple slides. And they shared that there could be a water market option within a voluntary agreement. And the collaborative has a feasibility report on types of groundwater markets that might work right here in this basin. Now it's up to the RAC to consider using those materials in this process moving forward. When I made my presentation, I was focusing on the 15 sub-area approach and not the sub-basin approach. That does not mean that the collaborative supports one option or the other. That simply means that there wasn't information about the sub-basin approach yet. So bear with me. OWRD has 6 priority areas that they have laid out, and they have 9 lower priority areas that they have laid out. In those 6 priority areas, we learned last meeting that OWRD intends to enforce permissible total withdrawals, or PTWs, which is pumpage prior to decline started, and to curtail users. In those 9 lower priority areas, OWRD intends to enforce permit decline conditions and encourage voluntary reductions. I'm going to pause. OWRD people, did I get that right? Yeah. Okay, thank you. So we are dealing with regulation in the management bucket, and we are also dealing with voluntary options in the voluntary bucket. I'm not going to speak to which one is better. There are people on the collaborative that see both sides. What I am here to do today is to highlight some of the voluntary actions in the bucket that can be taken by this community to reduce groundwater in both those priority and lower priority areas. We have options that we can implement here. And it's up to this RAC to make sure that there's flexibility in the rules so that voluntary actions can be taken by this community to help reduce the rate of decline. Folks in the back, there's no way you're going to be able to see that. I'm really sorry about that. It's a lot to fit in one slide. So, voluntary actions that can be taken in the 9 lower priority areas. Let's start there. In those areas, the strategies developed by the collaborative that could be considered by RAC members as possible approaches to help reduce groundwater use include implementing irrigation conservation measures, researching how to ensure that that conserved water remains in the ground, increasing the use of efficient irrigation technology, partnering with academic schools and the Agricultural Research Center to learn about alternative crops, implementing actions to protect and conserve groundwater-dependent ecosystems, exploring how OpenET or other remote sensing applications can be used as a tool to assess water use, and installing accountable water measurement devices on all non-exempt groundwater points of diversion. And lastly, OWRD can initiate cancellation of all known expired permits and water rights that haven't been beneficially used in 5 years. These are just some examples of the strategies that are laid out in the collaborative's groundwater plan. I'm not suggesting that this is the end-all be-all solution. I'm offering a glimpse into what this community has already done research on, has already looked into, and has already presented to the department and the commission as possible alternatives to regulation. In the 6 priority areas, the voluntary actions are pretty much the same. And also, there might be an opportunity to be the first voluntary agreement in the state. Again, we're pioneers here. So of course, we have to be the first to do something. The collaborative strategy was to analyze the provisions for voluntary agreements, to explore whether using voluntary agreements could be useful in the Harney Basin. That strategy has been completed. We have a study on voluntary agreements. Now the RAC can choose whether or not to use that. These next couple slides, I'm going to detail the information that we have available on voluntary agreements. For background, the collaborative worked with Colton Kelly, which is a law firm, and the Environmental Defense Fund, or EDF, to analyze how voluntary agreements might be developed and implemented in the Harney Basin to address groundwater issues. To assist the Harney Collaborative, their final report includes additional information, considerations, and recommendations. It has laid out information about the elements of a voluntary agreement that may be important for the Harney Basin. It has listed potential legal constraints or considerations for executing and implementing voluntary agreements. It includes ways in which voluntary agreements could be implemented, including the path and process to getting an agreement developed and approved. It also has information about how to implement the terms of the agreement. It has a discussion of the questions and concerns raised by the collaborative already. And lastly, it has information about where more research might be needed. And before we get too deep into the voluntary agreement analysis, I want to communicate that the RAC and OWRD do not have any mechanism or any authority to implement voluntary agreements. But at the same time, it's important to ensure that the rules that this RAC is developing are not so restrictive that we can't implement strategies like a voluntary agreement that have been developed by this community. That said, a voluntary agreement must come from the community. It must be presented to the commission, and it must be approved by that commission. An important question for the RAC to ask at this juncture is whether or not a voluntary agreement can be used as an alternative to curtailment to reach PTWs or permissible total withdrawals that were set by the department. Again, I'm not saying that the collaborative is seeking that. I'm simply sharing this available information that we have and posing a question that the RAC is going to have to grapple with. This community has been encouraged to take matters into their own hands through place-based planning. And it's worth exploring if they can continue to resolve their issues on a local level together. Now the details of the voluntary agreement. ORS 537745 authorizes the Water Resources Commission to encourage, promote, and recognize voluntary agreements among groundwater users from the same groundwater reservoir. The statute creates an opportunity for groundwater users to implement locally defined measures to manage groundwater use, so long as those measures are consistent with the intent, purposes, and requirements of the Groundwater Act. It's important for groundwater users to develop a voluntary agreement that clearly defines and explains how it meets statutory requirements and advances relevant legislative policies. The use of voluntary agreements in this context has not been tested. There are significant uncertainties related to the development and implementation for the purposes of groundwater management. However, we're pioneers. If joint voluntary action is either not taken or it's ineffective at maintaining reasonably stable groundwater levels or achieving other stated management policies, the commission can still come back and control the use of groundwater via regulatory action. So if this community wants to do a voluntary agreement, it has to come from you. It has to be presented to the commission. It has to be accepted by the commission. And you all have to be okay that if it doesn't work, that regulation can still occur. So a voluntary agreement, there are two main points to it. Point one, it must establish the area target for reduced water use and explain how that target advances the broader management objective. And two, it needs to establish a procedure to review and approve exhibits to the agreement for participation in an agreement-defined conservation program. So that's a lot of words. That basically means you need to define how you're going to reduce groundwater. And you need to have proof that it's reducing groundwater use. So breaking up these points a bit further. Point one, again, an agreement can establish the area target for reduced water use. The area target in statute states that the voluntary agreement must be among users of the same groundwater reservoir. Groundwater reservoir is further defined within the same statutory chapter to mean a designated body of standing or moving groundwater having exterior boundaries which may be ascertained or reasonably inferred up to the RAC. And breaking down point two further, again, point two was it needs to establish a procedure to review and approve exhibits to the agreement. It needs to have proof that there's participation in the agreement. The agreement itself can lay out conservation program eligibility and participation requirements. Participants in the voluntary agreement must agree to the regulatory requirement, PTWs, permissible total withdrawals, but they can choose a variety of methods to achieve it. Alternative crops that use less irrigation. Efficient irrigation measures, etc. And within the voluntary agreement, folks that are agreeing to it can also receive incentives to do so, also laid out in that same agreement. So again, folks in the back and probably in the front, there's no way you're going to be able to read that, and that's okay. According to the authors of the voluntary agreement analysis, elements of collaborative strategies that I mentioned before can be included in a voluntary agreement. Those include irrigation conservation measures, researching policy to ensure groundwater remains in the ground, implementing actions that protect and conserve groundwater-dependent ecosystems, exploring open ET or other remote sensing applications, increasing the use of efficient irrigation technology, and working with OWRD to enforce permit decline conditions, and working with OWRD to establish actions in the short term that they can use to reduce groundwater. Now again, voluntary agreements are not the end-all be-all solution. One strategy that the collaborative has developed is not the end-all be-all solution, but we have a lot of tools in our toolbox that we should use, and that this RAC should consider, and that this RAC should adapt flexibility in the rules so that we can make this work. To conclude, the community has already spent, I think, around 8 years that I know of, possibly longer, collaborating on how these changes in groundwater use should occur. And the department was a partner during that entire planning process, so none of this is new to the department. The collaborative has identified a number of tools that can be used to reduce groundwater pumping, that can be used to address the impacts of unsustainable levels. And the collaborative looks forward to continuing to work with the department and this RAC to develop a good approach and effective rules to stabilize groundwater levels. And the last point that I want to reiterate is that the collaborative knows that the RAC has a process to follow. And we knew a long time ago that this is where we were going to end up. We knew that irrigators in the room and others were waiting to know what the department was going to throw at them. We knew that. What we're doing now is we're aiming to have the RAC realize that there are options to implement. We want to make sure that the rules aren't so restrictive that we can't implement other strategies that have been developed by the community. The significance of this community's engagement, of the department's engagement, of the commission's engagement, tribes, watershed council, etc., is absolutely astounding. And it should not be overlooked during this process. Karen and I did the math. Karen did the math. No. She estimates that there have been around 14,000 community hours spent on planning in the place-based planning process. And the Watershed Council raised over $720,000 to do place-based planning, which is also astounding. We've worked really hard, and we have good options for you to use. Please use them. Thank you.
Sure. All right, any questions for Holly? Yes.
So for folks in the community who are maybe hearing about this for the first time, that should not be surprising, but it could surprise some folks. who should, folks in the community contact?
If folks in the community are wanting to get involved in the collaborative or get any information on what the collaborative has done, you can feel free to reach out. Can y'all hear me in the back now? Okay, let me go back. If you want more information about the collaborative, if you want more information about voluntary agreements, groundwater markets, or any of the other 29 strategies that the collaborative developed, please reach out to me. You can also reach out to Kristen Shellman, who is representing the county on our planning process. You can reach out to Brandon Hazlitt. You can reach out to Karen Moon, Brenda, Mark. We are here.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, really great information for everybody. There's, I mean, just a reminder, there's a whole nother part of this conversation beyond this regulatory piece that can help us meet these goals. So, good stuff. All right, so I want to quickly determine who, if there's anybody else who'd like to provide public comment. Go ahead. We've got one in the room here, two in the room. Okay, and then online, is there anybody?
Not seeing any hands. Ken said, wait until the we have the rules conversation.
Okay, so I got two in the room. Chris,
Chris Hall.
okay, I see your hand, Chris. So that would max out our public comment. So we're gonna need to kind of have a hard stop here at 4:45. We'll have to keep those comments short because as I mentioned at the top of the meeting, we have to be out of here at 5 o'clock so this room can get turned over for another meeting. So.
And we're always taking public comment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or phone call to Kelly.
Yeah, good reminder. You can always provide public comment.
And if my number, if it's hard to find my number, please reach out to Dally, and Dally, your local water master, Dally, stand up. Thank you. Yeah, reach out to him, and then he will get you in contact with me.
This is the right number on the bottom of the agenda?
Yes, that is the correct number.
Good call out, Fred.
There you go. Okay, so we're gonna turn it over to the fiscal impact statement, and we may not get through all this, but we'll go ahead and get it started, and we can always pick it up later.
All right, thank you, folks. Okay, so right now, I want to be having a conversation about the fiscal impact statement with you all. And so first off, I want to define what the fiscal impact statement is. So in the Oregon administrative law, there are requirements for filing rules with the state that there needs to be an analysis of the rules of a fiscal impact statement. So the fiscal impact statement details how the proposed rules will economically impact the state agencies, units of local government, and members of the public, as well as they define impacts to small businesses, which is 50 employees or less, considered a small business. And so I have begun taking in data and taking in sources of data to start developing this economic impact statement. This is where the RAC comes in, and I need you guys' help, right? We recognize that these rules are going to be pretty impactful, and so we need a way to quantify what that looks like. And so I'm just take through the next couple of slides and kind of go over first off. This is the data that we've collected so far, right? So we've done a business case study for economic value of water that is on the Division 512 page. And there was a case study for Harney and what the impacts to regulation of groundwater and how groundwater is used. I have gathered the USDA Census of Agriculture in 2022. It's a very robust data set that includes things like irrigated per county in Oregon. So in Harney, how many irrigated acres there are, how many employers of each irrigated employees, that sort of thing. It's a really robust. It's got a lot of different data sets. And I work with Business Oregon, who they have sent me to the Oregon Department of Employment data, and they have given me the list of all the small businesses within the county and how many employers they employ and their total salary within the salary. What I still need, this is reflected from a gentleman, Fred, I believe, from the Harney Electric Cooperative, I need to reach out to him and get some data on how this is going to impact the utilities in the county as well as OTEC as well. Now, question for the RAC, even members in the RAC too. What else should I be considering? What other data should I be considering?
Lisa has her hand up.
Sure, Lisa, please.
Yeah, I think it's really important to capture sort of the costs of not acting. And we know what some costs are specific in the Harney Basin, right? Because we do have a domestic well fund that's, you know, a taxpayer funded program to remediate and deepen domestic wells. There's also the WARF program, which is statewide, but I think could also apply in the Harney Basin. We've got the CREP, which I think is $43 million of federal money, and then quite a bit of state match as well. So just kind of capturing all these costs of not acting to stabilize the groundwater, I think is a really important piece of the fiscal picture. And I can help give you some of those sources.
Lisa, appreciate it.
Anybody else thoughts? I mean, this is really gonna be helpful information. Even if you don't know necessarily what the data is, but it's a subject area or something, you know, a clue that might send us on the right path. Things that need to be considered when we're talking economics in the back there.
So when you do the hay production, which you'll know what the hay production is, and you can whatever, figure out reducing that down by extending the water rights. You also need to do the trickle down effect of what that, you know, if it's $43,000 worth of loss in hay, they say 2 or 3 times in services and stuff, that increases, that goes down through there. So I think you also got to look at if it's $43,000 or say 40 million, excuse me, in loss of revenue, the trickle down effect that it goes through to employers, to equipment dealers, to all the way, and I don't know if it does that 2 or 3 times, it could be 100,000 or 100 million of effect in the economy when you do the trickle down effect. I don't know if you're doing that, but it's just one suggestion that.
No, that's a great suggestion, right? Yeah, looking.
I've got a question on that though, right? So if the revenue is $40 million.
Yeah.
That's how much you brought in.
That's the hay sales, just hay
Right,
sales.
that's the hay sale.
Mhm.
You can't, like, counting what you then paid in expenses doesn't,
No, so.
like, that's an
trickle down
additive.
effect that money goes down through the economy as it's spent through the economy, through dealerships, vehicles, everything.
Less
parts all the
tractors,
way
less
down,
cars.
that service, so that number, even though it's 40 million, it really is 80 million that it affects the economy. It's called service down effect.
It's how many times those dollars turn over with
Yeah.
the economy.
There's a direct multiplier by the amount of.
Yeah, there
amount
is.
of dollar generated by the natural resource on these economies, somewhere around 7 times.
The Oregon Economic Department has done studies on this a lot of
Yeah.
when there's jobs created, where there's a job loss, what the effect of that multiplier effect is in the community. So I think that's something we've got to consider as well, is, you know, not only is there direct impact on hay sales, but let's just say you lose 2 jobs off of that farm, and those 2 jobs, those have 4 kids, and then those 4 kids are not going to school. And then that school does not employ 2 more teachers, and then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the impact is significant.
There's a known formula for that too.
I'm gonna kick this out a little different, but that goes same with cow stocking rates per acre. You shut down X number of hay, that's gonna be produced in this county. That's gonna affect the stocking rate for the county, not only for the state.
Okay, thank you.
And that's gonna affect small businesses that are on the border of just barely fighting their way through each year anyway, so you could document the number of small businesses you expect to lose because of it.
Okay.
It's really important that these economic factors be considered, because right now, the community, every student in Harney County can qualify for a free and reduced lunch program. So it's already an economically significantly impacted community. And anything else that takes away from the economy is gonna have dramatic additional effects.
Okay, thank you. Mark, I saw you raise your hand. Yeah, okay.
So two things I don't know if it's gonna include it. So is it gonna, would that show investment losses? So if you take away, obviously, we got money in, if it's pumps. So is it gonna include anything to say what we lost that we invested in?
So are you talking about the fiscal impact statement?
Yeah.
Or, yeah, that is
Okay.
something that we would want to include, yeah.
Okay, what about, property value declines that this is gonna cause? Is that in there?
Yes, that is actually my next slide, that's part of the group, right? The county is gonna be affected by property values, so, yeah.
So the county, what about us?
Well,
In our bankers.
That's
I mean, that's what we're talking about.
I thought he was talking about the county court.
No,
Well, I mean,
Our budget.
I mean, there'll be an impact on tax revenue as well, right? So,
Yeah,
our property tax is gonna go way down,
sorry.
land values, no.
Right.
sure. So
We have such a big budget to begin with.
a question to you, Larissa, since you brought it up, and you tell me, I mean, you can redirect me if that's appropriate. How do we capture the economic loss of the investment that you have in pumps, wells, et cetera?
I can help about 3,500 an acre today.
Yeah.
Sure, okay, so 3,500 an acre,
That's just the equipment. We didn't farm it yet. It's got the equipment now.
right?
Not sell our track.
But should we also take into account like depreciation, right? Because that well is
Yeah.
good for a certain amount of time and you potentially paid it off over, like, say you've had the well in place for 50 years.
Yeah.
Is that, should
You'd
that
have
be
to have the
included as an
tractor, the
economic loss?
baler, the mower, you'd have to,
Equipment.
take the whole circle if you're gonna do it.
Sure, so I'm being real serious here. How do we get to those numbers?
We need to work with, the university extension economists. They do this stuff all the time, so.
Yeah, because there's a depreciation factor.
This is something that's.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good comment. Who do we need to go talk to is another question, right? You know, not just what data do we need, who are the people that are gonna give us the data, and that's.
There's that right here. Bill Jagger from OSU was given a large sum of money to do an economic impact with a numerical model. It'd be great to check back with them.
Yep, and we have been. We're waiting for that to publish as well.
What about the loss of schools? We have schools in our county that have 2 or 3 students in them right now. So I think that would be a big impact. I mean, we have some schools from Burns that are over 100 miles from here. So I think the impact to our community on that is something that you need to factor in.
Sure, okay.
And you can get that information from the ESD.
Yes, thank you.
Education services.
This is great. This is exactly the kind of stuff we need. What else? What else, anything else for the presentation? All right, everybody, let's quiet down a little bit so we can make sure we get all this. Go ahead.
I guess I'm curious, you said you got a list of all the small business or whatever. I guess I wonder about the agricultural community of those that are not running under a business name, they're running just, personally.
Yeah.
But it is a small business, that makes sense?
That makes sense, yes, absolutely.
Okay, so we'll need to just validate what is included in that data set. Cool. That makes sense.
And also,
Yeah.
so you're gonna take a snapshot of a point in time of the value of that land under production, correct?
I don't know how else we do it.
Yeah.
Well, that's one of the values. The other value is, it's a producing asset, so the other value is what it would have returned had it remained in production going forward. And so, and that is the true value, especially to the community and going forward. And I mean, that can be calculated as well, but I mean, that's the real, at the end of the day, that's the real value that.
So how, I know this is an honest question, and I'm trying to know, how is that different than understanding the value of the crops that are being grown per acre on that?
No, it's the same, it just,
Okay.
but if you're gonna say, okay, all this land under production, it's worth $5,500 an acre to sell, if it, you know, everything being considered, if you're gonna continue on to end up water industry, whatever. I mean, that's what it's for, but you, if you owned it for 20 years, it's gonna generate more than $5,500.
Sure. So what we should be doing is looking at the value of the land to just sell outright, as well as the value of it producing over some time period.
That's correct.
And what should that time period be in your opinion?
My life.
Hundreds of years.
And how long is that? No, I'm not going to talk about it.
I've been farming for 60 years. So,
Cause you're looking at our children and our grandchildren.
yeah, and this is something that we've been planning on handing down from generation to generation. We're here to stay because of what we did and what we received from the state of Oregon to be able to get to do it. Planning on a future impact on our grandchildren.
My investment is for hundreds of years, not just for me.
Right.
I don't need all this for the rest of my life. I do it for my kids so they can keep farming, because they can keep farming and they can keep farming.
That's what I keep telling my kids.
That's why I'm here. That's why we're fighting for the generations.
Yeah, I mean, the other question is, are they going to? It's like,
Yes,
no-
they haven't
nobody-
come yet.
Nobody in my family did, so.
No, that's, you gotta make the opportunity for them.
Sure, absolutely.
That's what we're trying to do.
My grandchildren, mine had to
Okay. Okay, that's it. So, I mean, really, this is very open-ended, so the time we have remaining, and again, this isn't all, you know, go home and think about it. And share your thoughts with, you know, email Kelly, come up with other ideas, other sources of information, like further capture data, that's gonna be really helpful. But if that's, nobody else has any questions right now on this, we'll move to our public comment. Okay? All right, so you got two in the back. Yes, you two, so you in the back. Yep, you start, and then we'll go in front of you, and then we'll go online.
My name's Scott Montgomery. I've been measuring wells out of Beaver Springs since 2013. And I got a letter, I think it's addressed to Mark Owens. I'm reading the second page on it, how you're gonna curtail the non-critical subject area. It says, we intend to achieve our goal of holding compliance to these sub areas and enforcing on permit compliant conditions for voluntary agreements. Well, I'm here to tell you, you could have shut down a lot of Beaver Springs back in 2013 if you would have enforced your permit compliant conditions. So why didn't you do that then? And how are we supposed to believe that you're gonna do it in the future?
Again, you mind your questions to get around with. But we don't want to be really good.
Yeah, Brent Clemens with Party Electric Co-op. I'm the one you need to get a hold of on the economic stuff, and I'm actually working on some numbers now that I have your sub area. But one thing that I wanted to bring up earlier in the public comment is that on the study that was done by Water Resources and Geological Society or whatever, I got a hold of that report and started looking, and the first thing that came out to me was in the executive summary. It talked about a period of time where Harney Basin has increased its pumpage by 300%. And that was shown in there quite a bit and tried to me, be a shock factor that, oh my God, we need to do something because we're really overusing this thing. Well, I can tell you, every gallon of water that's pumped in Harney Basin is done with power from Harney Electric or Oregon Trail Electric. And so I went back, because we have the data, I went back to the I don't remember the exact date, 1991 or whatever that they used up to 2018. Harney Electric's total kilowatt hour cell for irrigation went up just under 100%. So your report is off by 200%. That's the first data that I have. So as Roger was saying, we need to know your data. You need to give it to us because I'm suspect of the report that you paid millions of dollars to get. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Okay, we have one comment online. Okay, Chris?
Yes, hi, thanks again. My name for the record is Christopher Hall with Water League. And I thought that presentation on the place-based planning was just lovely. And I thought what Holly presented was really an example of some of the best ways that, you know, people can work together to solve problems. I do have a question though, regarding the voluntary agreements. I don't see how a senior water right user is going to voluntarily give up their water to a junior water right holder. And it kind of feels like that's the elephant in the room. And I'd love to see a detailed and fully transparent accounting for how that might work. Because if I understand correctly, the essence of a voluntary agreement is coming to statutory levels of compliance with without necessarily having the state itself engineer that compliance. It's actually having the the voluntary acts of local community members. And that means holding each other accountable with contracts that they all sign and that they could sue each other over if that were the case, to make sure that everybody's like, keeping their water low. And if I mean, I've been looking at how senior water right users use water in the state of Oregon, and generally their attitude is, I'm going to keep using water, as long as I can, and juniors are going to get shut off. And that's just the bottom line. Lastly, it occurs to me that this notion of going from a sub area to a sub basin, which was discussed in the first part of this meeting, kind of feels almost like the voluntary agreements. It's like basically all of these sub areas in the North Harney County region voluntarily giving up their water to Crane. And if they can pull that off, maybe then, voluntary agreements are a possibility. But I think it's the elephant in the room, and I'd really love to see how that might work out. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Can I address that?
Sure, member of the RAC.
So, what Chris doesn't understand is that, one of the reasons that has a possibility of working is that very, very few of us that have more than one pivot have only one priority date. And so if you look at the people sitting here, 4 or 5 of us here, 6 of us here, all of us have very old water rights and much newer ones. And so we realize that in order to make this voluntary agreement work, then we work together so that we protect, or at least pump as much as we can together, rather than just sitting there saying, fine, I'll just have these 2 pivots, you can shut either 10 off. That's not going to be how it works.
And even if you have the oldest water right in the basin, if you don't have water, it doesn't mean anything.
And I think Holly addressed that in her list here, that there needs to be a way to keep water in the ground, policy or whatever.
Okay, thanks for that clarity. So that wraps up our meeting today. I mean, we got off to a little bumpy start, but I really think that was highly productive. I think that's how we're going to move this forward. A little bit of friction helps move it forward. I think the department, all of us heard each other. There's opportunity, I believe, to adjust and look at how we can present this information, workshop a little bit so that we all understand it, identify the room for separating science and policy decisions, and where those areas of agreement and discussions will land. So look forward to, a new direction, potentially for the next agenda.
Hey, Brian, before we lose people in the room,
Hold on, everybody, one announcement, before you go.
yeah, hey, before we lose